In a quiet Colorado winter, Caleb Doyle had nothing left but an old truck, a rented room, and a German shepherd named Sable. Once he had saved lives as a combat nurse. Now people called him too wounded to be trusted. Then a distant aunt left him an abandoned workshop on a snowy mountain with one strange warning buried in her will. Do not seal the basement before the snow has thawed twice. Caleb almost walked away until Sable found a door beneath the barn that smelled of old secrets and unfinished truth. What waited below was not treasure, but the erased life's work of a woman who refused to disappear. If this story touches your heart, tell me where you're watching from. Leave your thoughts below, and please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 5,000 subscribers so I can keep writing more meaningful stories for you. Winter did not fall on Pinecrest Ridge, Colorado like a punishment. It arrived clean and bright, laying white shawls over the roofs, polishing the bare branches of the aspens, and turning every fence post into a small, patient monk. In the mornings, sunlight bounced off the snow with such mercy that even the gas station signs looked forgiven. The mountains stood beyond town in their blue silence, old kings wearing crowns of ice. Caleb Doyle lived beneath those mountains in room 6 of the Ridgeway Motor Lodge, a place too small to be called sad and too clean to be called hopeless. The carpet was brown, the curtains were beige, and the heater made a sound like an old man clearing his throat before telling a lie. Caleb had been there 8 months, long enough to know which floorboard complained, which parking spot collected black ice, and which nights the wind would rattle the window until Sable lifted his head. Caleb was 49, 6'3", broad through the shoulders, built like the army had carved him from stubborn oak and then left him out in weather. His hair was dark ash brown, kept short but no longer military short, with a narrow silver streak at his right temple. His beard was trimmed close, peppered with gray. He had the kind of handsome face people noticed and then looked away from because his eyes carried too much weather. Those eyes were gray-blue, with a faint amber cast near the pupils, like winter sky seen through old whiskey. Once Caleb had known how to keep men alive. He had been a combat medic, then a flight nurse attached to forward surgical teams through 3 rotations in the Middle East. He had learned to read breath before words, blood pressure before fear, pain before pride. He had worked beneath the chop of helicopters, in heat that made metal burn the skin, in tents where prayers were said so quickly they sounded like orders. He had held pressure on wounds, counted seconds between heartbeats, told strangers to stay with him in a voice calm enough to fool both of them. He had been good at that. Good enough that people trusted him when the world around them had stopped making sense. But after he came home, the world had asked him to make sense of himself. That had been harder. After the divorce, Caleb's PTSD file had become less like a medical record and more like a weapon wrapped in polite language. His former wife's family had not called him dangerous. No, they were too educated for that. Their attorney had said he was not sufficiently stable for ongoing advisory responsibilities. A risk, a concern, a man whose hands had once steadied others, now described as hands one should not trust. The Veterans Recovery Program removed him from its medical advisory roster. No shouting, no scene. Just a letter, a signature, and the quiet burial of a man's usefulness. Since then, Caleb had taken whatever work did not ask him to explain himself. He repaired broken chairs and cracked dressers for a second-hand store on Maple Street. He changed light fixtures for a widow who paid him in canned peaches. Twice a week, he helped at a small veterinary clinic, lifting anxious dogs onto exam tables and holding them steady with the patience of a cathedral. He avoided rooms where people asked, "So what do you do?" That question had too many ghosts. On that clear winter morning, Caleb sat on the edge of the motel bed, elbows on his knees, wearing a faded army green t-shirt and old olive cargo pants rubbed pale at the knees. His red and black flannel jacket hung over the back of a chair, cuffs frayed, collar soft from years of wear. Around his neck, tucked beneath the shirt, hung his silver military dog tags. He rarely took them off. Some men kept photographs. Caleb kept metal. Sable lay near the door. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, large and black and tan, with a warm gold chest, dark saddle markings, and a narrow silver streak running crookedly along his back from behind the left shoulder toward the spine. The mark came from a mild chemical accident years ago, back when Sable had worked in a military therapy dog program. It did not make him look damaged. It made him look marked by moonlight. Caleb often told him that. "You know," Caleb said, reaching for one boot, "you look like a wolf king who got brushed by the moon." Sable opened one honey-brown eye. "Not impressed?" Sable sighed through his nose, the long, patient sigh of an animal who had endured human humor and expected no improvement. "Fair?" The dog wore a dark brown leather collar with a small metal tag engraved with his name. His right ear had a tiny notch along the edge, visible only when the light caught it. He did not bark much. Sable believed in economy. A look, a shift of weight, a low sound in the throat, these were usually enough to correct the foolishness of men. That morning, however, Sable had been restless since dawn. He had paced once from the door to the window, then sat beside Caleb's duffel bag and stared at it as if it held evidence. Caleb noticed. He always noticed Sable. "What?" he asked softly. Sable looked toward the door. A knock came. Not loud, not urgent. 3 polite taps. Caleb stood too quickly. His shoulders tightened before his mind caught up. Sable rose with him, moving close, but not crowding. Caleb placed 2 fingers briefly against the dog tags beneath his shirt. Present. Room 6, Pinecrest Ridge. Snow outside. Dog beside him. He opened the door. The motel owner's grandson, a lanky man in his 20s, with a knit cap pulled too low, stood holding an envelope. "Mail came for you, Mr. Doyle. Looked official." "Thanks, Aaron." "No problem." Aaron glanced at Sable, who stared back with calm professional disappointment. "Morning, Officer Sable." Sable blinked. Aaron took that as a blessing and left. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and addressed in clean legal type. Elias Boone, attorney at law. Caleb did not know the name at first. Then, after a moment, he remembered hearing it in passing years ago from his mother, back when family names still moved through kitchens like harmless smoke. Boone had handled land, wills, stubborn widows, disputed fences, and the occasional bar fight that had matured into a property issue. Caleb opened the envelope with a pocket knife. The letter was short. Dr. Mara V. Doyle had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Caleb was requested to attend the reading of certain provisions of her will. He had been named beneficiary of a property located above Pinecrest Ridge, a former woodworking shop and outbuildings on 12 acres of mountain land. Caleb read the letter twice, then a third time, slower. Mara V. Doyle. The name came back not as a person at first, but as a winter afternoon from decades ago. A tall, silver-haired woman standing near his mother's kitchen table. Sharp eyes, long fingers, a smell of peppermint tea and wood oil. She had handed Caleb a small walnut-handled carving knife before he left for basic training. "For your hands," she had said. He had laughed because he was 19 and stupid in the sacred way of young men. "I'm not much of an artist." "No," Mara had replied. "But someday you may need to make something that doesn't scream." He had not understood her. The knife was still in his toolbox. Caleb lowered the letter. Sable watched him. "Well," Caleb said, "apparently I have inherited a mountain." Sable remained solemn. "Try to control your excitement." By noon, Caleb was sitting across from Elias Boone in an office that smelled of old paper, burnt ginger, and wool. Boone was 68, thin, silver-haired, and dressed in a brown cardigan under a tweed jacket. His glasses sat low on his nose, and his leather briefcase looked old enough to have its own legal opinions. On the desk between them sat a plate of ginger cookies, so dark around the edges they appeared to have survived a small house fire. "Cookie?" Elias asked. Caleb glanced at them. "No, thank you." "Wise," Elias said. "I bake to remind people the law could always be worse." Sable lay beside Caleb's chair, alert but still. Elias had welcomed him without fuss, which Caleb appreciated more than he expected. The reading was not ceremonial. There were no grieving relatives, no polished table full of hungry eyes. Just Elias, Caleb, Sable, a snow-bright window, and the ghost of a woman Caleb had barely known. "Mara had very little patience for theatrics," Elias said, unfolding the will, "unless she was the one creating them." Caleb listened. The property was real. The taxes were paid. The buildings were old, but structurally sound according to the last inspection. The woodworking shop had once served as both home and business. Mara had lived there for almost 30 years after leaving pharmaceutical research. "Leaving?" Caleb asked. Elias paused. That was the word she preferred. And the word she didn't prefer? "Removed," Elias said. "Discredited, buried alive in footnotes, take your pick." Caleb looked down at his hands. Elias continued. "There is one condition attached to the inheritance." Caleb almost smiled. "Of course there is." "You are not to reseal, demolish, fill, transfer control of, or permit third-party containment of the basement beneath the main storage barn until the snow on the property has fully thawed twice." Caleb stared at him. Elias folded his hands. Outside, snow slid from a roof across the street with a soft thump. "Say that again," Caleb said. Elias did. "The snow has to melt twice?" "Fully thaw," Elias corrected. Mara was particular. "That's not a condition. That's a weather report with legal delusions." For the first time, Elias smiled. "She would have liked you." Caleb leaned back. "Why?" "She did not explain in the will. That seems inconvenient." Mara believed inconvenience was underrated. Caleb rubbed his jaw. Beneath the table, Sable shifted and pressed lightly against his boot. Elias watched the dog, then Caleb. "She did leave a personal note, but it is to be opened only after you visit the property." Caleb disliked that, not because it was mysterious, but because it felt intentional. He had spent too much of his life around sealed envelopes, closed doors, and people who knew more than they said. "What did she do in that shop?" he asked. "Woodwork, adaptive furniture, handrails, walking supports, therapy benches, anything that helped people live in bodies that had stopped obeying them." "She was a drug researcher?" "She was many things," Elias said. "Most inconvenient people are." Before Caleb could answer, Elias opened another folder. "There is also the matter of an offer." He slid a printed document across the desk. "North Star Land and Timber." The number at the bottom was absurd. Caleb read it, then looked up. "This is a mistake." "It is not." "This land isn't worth that." "No." Caleb waited. Elias's face lost some of its humor. "North Star contacted my office within 48 hours of Mara's death, becoming part of public record. They described the offer as time-sensitive." "Why?" "They claim to be developing a mountain wellness retreat, breathwork, restorative silence, herbal tea, expensive chairs with no back support, that sort of thing." Caleb looked back at the number. 7 times market value. Enough to leave the motel, enough to pay debts, enough to buy a place where the heater did not sound terminally ill, enough to disappear into a quiet town where no one knew what had been written about him in careful legal sentences. For a moment, the paper looked less like a trap and more like mercy. That was what frightened him. He thought of signing, just briefly. His mind opened the door to that future. Sell the land, take the money, Let the dead keep their riddles. He owed Mara nothing. Blood had not made them close. One knife, one memory, one strange sentence in a will that did not make a man responsible for another person's unfinished war. Then Sable lifted his head, not sharply, not dramatically. He simply looked at Caleb with those dark honey eyes, calm as judgment and warmer than forgiveness. Caleb folded the offer once and set it back on the desk. "I'll see the property before I decide anything." Elias nodded as if this had been the only acceptable answer, though he was polite enough not to say so. By late afternoon, Caleb's pickup climbed the road above Pinecrest Ridge. The truck was old, blue once, though winter salt and time had argued with that claim. Sable sat in the passenger seat, upright, nose occasionally touching the cold window. Caleb wore his red and black flannel jacket over the faded army green shirt, sleeves pushed up despite the cold. His canvas coat lay behind the seat, along with a toolbox, a coil of rope, 2 blankets, and the walnut-handled carving knife he had taken from the motel before leaving. He did not know why he brought it. That was not entirely true. He brought it because Mara had given it to him before he became a man who knew too much about pain. He brought it because some gifts wait years to become messages. Pinecrest Ridge fell away below them, bright and small. The diner's roof was capped in white. Smoke rose from chimneys in soft gray ribbons. A church bell rang somewhere, not solemnly, but as if reminding the hour to keep moving. The world looked clean enough to be believed. Caleb distrusted that kind of beauty. The road narrowed, curving between stands of pine and aspen. Snow clung to the branches. Sunlight broke through in pale gold panels, flashing across the windshield. For a while, there was only the sound of tires on packed snow and Sable's steady breathing. Then the shop appeared. It stood halfway up the slope, set back from the road behind a split-rail fence and 2 old pines bent under snow. The main building was long and low, cedar-sided, with tall windows facing east. Behind it sat a storage barn, darker, broader, its roof heavy with white. A smaller cabin leaned nearby, not collapsing, only tired. The whole place looked like a ship stranded in a frozen sea. Caleb parked near the gate, but did not get out immediately. Sable did not move either. For reasons Caleb could not name, the silence inside the truck felt crowded. "You know this place?" he asked. Sable's ears angled forward. Caleb watched him. The dog's gaze fixed on the workshop, then shifted toward the storage barn behind it. His nose twitched once, twice. The silver streak along his back caught the lowering sun. Caleb stepped out. Cold air struck his face, clean and pine-sharp. His boots sank into fresh snow. The world smelled of cedar, iron, and distant wood smoke. He opened Sable's door, and the German shepherd jumped down lightly for a dog his size, landing without a sound. Together they walked to the main entrance. The closer Caleb came, the more details emerged. The brass handle worn smooth, the nail heads dark with age, the faint marks of tools along the doorframe. Someone had cared for this place. Not recently, maybe, but deeply. Care had weight. It remained after hands were gone. Across the door, half hidden beneath frost, words had been carved into the wood. Caleb brushed snow away with his glove. Wood remembers the hand. The letters were uneven, carved by someone who had understood both patience and pressure. Caleb placed his palm over the words. For a moment he saw Mara's hand instead of his own. Long fingers, a pencil behind one ear. A woman who had once given a boy a knife and a sentence he did not understand. Something moved in Caleb's chest. Not grief. He had not known her well enough for clean grief. It was more like regret arriving early before it had earned the right. "I don't know what you wanted from me," he said under his breath. Behind him, Sable stiffened. Caleb turned. The dog stood facing the storage barn. His ears were up, His tail was low but not tucked. No barking, no theatrics, only stillness, the kind that made the air around it listen. "Sable?" The German shepherd took 3 slow steps through the snow, then stopped beside the barn's side door. A heavy tarp hung there, stiff with frost, partly covering a lower entrance Caleb had not noticed from the truck. Sable lowered his head and sniffed along the bottom edge. Then came a sound from deep in his throat. Not a growl exactly. A warning, restrained and old. Caleb walked toward him, each boot step crunching too loudly in the white quiet. The barn loomed above them, its shadow blue on the snow. Up close, Caleb could see that the tarp had been tied carefully, not thrown over in haste. Beneath it, something metal caught the last light of day. He reached for the frozen rope. Sable did not look at him. He kept staring at the covered door, body still as carved stone. Caleb's hand paused. The mountain wind moved through the pines, and snow dust fell from a branch in a soft silver veil. For the first time since receiving Elias Boone's letter, Caleb felt the shape of the inheritance change. It was not land, it was not money, it was not even a shop. It was a question someone had buried beneath winter and left for the one man she believed might hesitate before selling silence. Caleb pulled the tarp aside just enough to see the outline of a low steel door. Cold metal, old lock, no handle on the outside, and beneath a lace of frost, scratched by hand into the frame, were words too worn to read in the fading light. Sable gave one quiet breath against Caleb's leg. The sun dropped behind the pines. Caleb stood with his palm still gripping the tarp, the offer from North Star folded in his coat pocket, the old carving knife resting in his toolbox, and the dog beside him listening to something no human ear could yet hear. The workshop behind them held its breath. And under the snow, something that had waited a very long time remained silent, but no longer alone. Morning found the workshop before Caleb did. It slipped through the tall eastern windows in long, pale bands, softened by snowlight, laying itself across the floorboards as if the sun had come down on its knees. Dust hung in the air, but not the gray dust of neglect. This dust was golden, fine as flour, old sawdust lifted from sleep by the opening of a door. Caleb stood just inside the main room with Sable at his side and felt the strange discomfort of entering a place that had not expected visitors, yet had prepared for them anyway. Nothing was where ruin would have put it. The chisels hung by size along a pegboard. Hand planes rested on a shelf, their wooden bodies dark with oil and use. Clamps lined one wall like patient iron birds. Boards of walnut, cedar, pine, and maple stood upright in careful rows, labeled in Mara's narrow handwriting. Even the broom leaned in a corner with the dignity of a retired soldier. Caleb had known abandoned buildings. He had slept in them overseas, passed through them during evacuation drills, patched men up beneath ceilings that had forgotten how to stay whole. Abandoned places usually had a smell: damp, rot, old fear, mice. Mara's workshop smelled of pine shavings, linseed oil, peppermint tea, and something medicinal so faint it might have been memory playing tricks. Sable moved first, not fast, not searching. He walked with a slow solemnity that made Caleb think of old kings entering a chapel. His paws crossed the floor without hurry. His nose worked close to the ground, then lifted toward the workbenches, then toward the cold hearth at the far end of the room. Caleb closed the door behind them. The sound echoed gently. "Well," he said, because silence often needed something ordinary set inside it. "She kept a cleaner shop than I keep a motel room." Sable did not look back. "Fine. Low standard." The German shepherd paused beside a long bench under the window. On it lay a half-finished wooden brace, shaped to support a forearm. The edges had been sanded smooth, the leather straps cut but not attached. Beside it sat a pencil, sharpened to a perfect point, as if Mara had only stepped out to answer the kettle. Caleb touched the brace with 2 fingers. It was light, strong, carefully curved, not furniture, not art, something between mercy and engineering. He walked deeper into the shop. Against one wall were drawings pinned in layers, chairs with widened arms, bed rails with hidden grips, walking supports designed not to look clinical, small desks angled for hands that trembled. Each drawing carried measurements, notes, corrections, and names. R. Bellamy, left grip lower by 1.25 inches. Pride intact. Do not make it ugly. Caleb read that twice. Pride intact. He almost smiled. Mara had not merely built things people needed. She had built them in a way that refused to embarrass the person using them. Caleb understood that kind of mercy better than he wanted to. There were many ways to help a person while quietly making them feel smaller. The world had invented entire systems for it. He found a cabinet of small wooden boxes, each one lined with felt. Some were plain, some had carved lids, a falcon, a pine branch, a river stone, a pair of folded wings. Inside one unfinished box lay a note in Mara's handwriting. For metals they cannot look at yet. Caleb's throat tightened without asking permission. He set the note down. There were no saints in this room. Saints did not label clamps or sharpen pencils. Saints did not leave unpaid heating bills in a drawer or mutter insults at dull saw blades, as Mara had apparently done in the margins of one repair log. But something sacred had happened here all the same. Not the kind that made stained glass glow. The smaller kind. A handrail placed at the right height. A chair that let a man sit without asking for help. A box that allowed memory to close its lid for one more day. Sable reached the hearth. It was built of gray stone, wide and low, with a black iron screen in front. Beside it sat a small wooden chair with a cushion worn thin at the center. A folded blanket lay over one arm, blue wool faded almost silver. The dog stopped. Caleb watched as Sable lowered his head to the blanket. He did not sniff it quickly. He breathed it in slowly, once, then again. His tail sank a few inches. The notch in his right ear caught the light. For a moment, the big German shepherd seemed older than 7. Old in the way mountains were old, carrying weather that no one else remembered. Sable? The dog did not come. Caleb crossed the room and knelt beside him. The blanket smelled faintly of dust, wood smoke, peppermint, and dog. Caleb placed his hand on Sable's back over the silver streak. The dog leaned into the touch, but his eyes remained on the chair. "You knew her," Caleb murmured. Sable's ears shifted at Mara's absence, or maybe at Caleb's voice. It was a foolish thing to say, perhaps. Dogs knew places, smells, routines. They did not sit around building family trees or reflecting on unfinished grief. But Sable's stillness did not feel like detection. It felt like recognition. Caleb had seen that expression on men who returned to old bases, old hospitals, old streets where something had once ended. Not fear, not comfort. The face one made before an unmarked grave. He sat back on his heels. In the pocket of his flannel, the folded North Star offer seemed heavier than paper had any right to be. By noon, Caleb drove back into town because the workshop had no food except a tin of tea bags and something in a jar that might once have been jam but had clearly chosen another path. Pinecrest Ridge looked brighter from below, all snowy roofs, red brick storefronts, and hanging baskets filled with evergreen instead of flowers. The town had the kind of winter prettiness that appeared on postcards and then quietly raised property taxes. Caleb parked near the post office and walked to the diner beside it. A wooden sign over the door read, "June's," painted in red letters that had survived many storms by sheer stubbornness. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, buttered toast, and soup strong enough to make a man reconsider all his sins. A woman behind the counter looked up before the bell over the door finished ringing. She was in her 60s, full-faced, silver hair cut short around her ears, wearing a cream-colored apron with June stitched in red thread. Her eyes were warm in the same way a stove was warm, useful, necessary, and capable of burning the careless. She looked at Caleb, then at Sable, then back at Caleb. "You Mara's boy?" Caleb hesitated. "I'm Caleb Doyle." "That answers a different question." He removed his hat. "I suppose I'm her relative." "Far one?" "Far enough that I had to think before remembering her face." June wiped her hands on a towel and studied him like she was checking a carton of milk for truth and expiration. "June Harlow, Mara was my friend." "Sit down before you stand there looking tragic enough to ruin lunch." Caleb blinked. Sable wagged his tail once. "Traitor," Caleb muttered. June pointed to a booth near the window. "Dog can sit there if he behaves better than most men, which, judging by his eyes, won't be hard." Caleb sat. Sable settled beside the booth with the composure of a retired judge. June brought coffee without asking, and a bowl of chicken stew, so thick the spoon stood nearly upright. "I didn't order." "You looked underfed in the soul." She set down cornbread. "That costs extra." Caleb looked at the food, then at her. "Do people around here always attack strangers with hospitality?" "Only the suspicious ones." He took a bite because refusing would have felt like insulting an altar. The stew was hot, peppery, and better than anything from the motel microwave had a moral right to be compared with. June leaned on the counter across from him. "You selling?" There it was, no winding road, no polite weather talk, straight to the locked room. "I haven't decided." "North Star offer you a mountain of money?" Caleb said nothing. "That's a yes." "I came to look first." "Lookin' isn't keeping." He put the spoon down. "You don't know me." "No," June said. "That's why I'm asking before I decide whether to like you." Caleb almost laughed. It escaped as a breath, small and reluctant. June noticed. Her face softened by half an inch, which on her seemed generous. "Mara helped people here," she said. Quietly, rudely sometimes. "She once told a man his new walker looked like a surrender flag and rebuilt it with black walnut because apparently dignity requires better grain." Caleb looked out the window. Snow slid in bright sheets from the post office roof. "She was a scientist," he said. "She was a woman with hands," June replied. "Science was one thing she did with them." June told him about the veterans who had come to the workshop over the years, men and women grown old around memories they could not throw away. Mara built them handrails that looked like art, chairs that did not scream hospital, boxes for medals, low benches for therapy dogs to climb onto without jarring bad joints. "She hated one word most," June said. "What word?" "Broken." Caleb's jaw tightened. June saw it. She had the mercy not to point at the wound while it was showing. "Mara said people weren't broken. They were carrying maps of pain other folks were too lazy to read." Caleb looked down at his hands. Large hands. Capable hands. Hands that had been written about in reports by people who never saw them steady another human being through panic, shock, or shame. Sable rose quietly and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's leg beneath the table. June watched the dog do it. Her eyes changed. Not pity. Recognition. "He's done that before," she said. "Many times." Mara would have liked him. Caleb looked at Sable. "I think she knew him." June's hand paused on the coffee pot. That was the moment the room seemed to lean closer. "What makes you say that?" she asked. He went to her hearth like he was visiting someone. June set the pot down slowly. "Mara worked with a military therapy dog recovery program for a while. Not officially, mind you. Mara had a casual relationship with official. She helped with adaptive supports for injured dogs, too. There was one German shepherd." June looked at Sable's back. The silver streak showed above the booth line. Had a pale mark, if I remember. Caleb did not move. Sable's ears tilted toward June. "She never told me his name," June said. "Only called him the moon-brushed one." Caleb felt something inside him turn, not like a key yet, but like metal touched by a magnet. The joke he had made for years, the Wolf King brushed by the moon, had not been his joke at all, perhaps. Or maybe grief and kindness had a way of choosing the same language when they met the same dog. He reached down and touched Sable's collar. The dog leaned against him. June cleared her throat, suddenly busy with the towel. "Eat before it gets cold. Emotional revelations are terrible for stew." Later, Caleb returned to the workshop with a paper bag of food, a thermos of coffee June had called survival grade, and a warning not to trust anyone whose offer had too many zeros and too much stationery. Inside Mara's shop, the afternoon light had shifted gold. Caleb began with the desk near the hearth. He was not searching for treasure. He told himself that twice, then stopped because lying aloud in an empty room made a man sound foolish. He opened drawers carefully, noting what he moved, laying papers in stacks on the bench. Bills? Receipts? Notes to herself? Sketches. Letters returned unopened. The letters were addressed to Halwick Pharma. Caleb recognized the company name. Everyone did. Their commercials ran during ball games and evening news programs. Silver-haired couples walking through gardens, hands clasped, voices promising brighter tomorrows in careful tones. Halwick sold hope in polished bottles and called it science. Mara's letters were not polished. They were precise, dense, and edged with anger held under discipline. Caleb could not understand every technical term, but he understood enough. Data discrepancies, unauthorized formulation changes, attribution removal, patient safety concerns in adult volunteer trials, internal review request. He found early research drafts bearing Mara's name beside Victor Arlen's, then later printed articles where Victor's name remained and Mara's had vanished into acknowledgement lines, then footnotes, then nothing. Victor Arlen appeared in newspaper clippings too. A younger man at first, smiling beside Mara in a lab photo. Then older, alone at podiums, accepting awards, announcing breakthroughs, speaking about the courage to accelerate healing. Caleb studied the photographs. Mara's face in the older images was not soft. She looked like a woman who expected the world to be difficult and had sharpened herself accordingly. Victor, beside her, looked brilliant and eager, his admiration almost boyish. It would have been easier if betrayal announced itself early, if every Judas wore a black coat and smelled of smoke. Most did not. Some smiled beside you in the beginning. Caleb was still sorting the papers when headlights swept across the workshop windows. He straightened. Sable stood before Caleb, heard the tires outside. A car door closed, then another. Caleb stepped onto the porch. Elias Boone stood in the snow, wearing a dark wool coat, a brown hat, and an expression of mild dissatisfaction with gravity. He held his leather briefcase in one hand and a bakery box in the other. "I brought documents," Elias said, "and cookies." Caleb eyed the box. "Are those evidence or food?" Legally unsettled. Elias came inside, stamped snow from his shoes, and looked around the workshop. For once, he did not make a joke immediately. "Still smells like her," he said. Caleb set Mara's letters on the desk. "You knew about Halwick." "I knew she had history with them. I did not know all of it." "You knew enough to build that strange condition into the will." Elias removed his gloves slowly. His hands were narrow, veined, careful. "Mara built the condition. I made it enforceable." "Why not tell me outright?" "Because wills can be challenged. Letters can disappear. People can be pressured before they know what they're protecting." Elias looked toward the storage barn through the window. "And because Mara trusted delay more than disclosure." Caleb handed him the North Star offer. Elias sighed. "I did some digging after you left." "And?" "North Star Land and Timber is owned by a holding company in Salt Lake. That holding company is partly financed by a private equity fund with prior investment ties to Halwick subsidiaries. Not proof of wrongdoing, but enough smoke to keep one's eyebrows awake." Caleb looked toward the papers on the bench. "Why would Halwick want an old woodshop?" "That," Elias said, "is the question trying very hard not to introduce itself." They worked until dark. Elias made notes. Caleb labeled stacks. Sable moved between hearth, door, and barn-facing window, never settling for long. The snow outside turned blue, then violet, then black beneath the moon. The workshop grew intimate under lamplight. Wood grain glowed. Shadows gathered under benches. The old place no longer felt asleep. It felt like it was listening. Elias left around 9, promising to return after checking land records and warning Caleb not to sign, sell, burn, bury, transfer, authorize, acknowledge, or nod vaguely in the presence of paperwork, until further notice. Caleb locked the door behind him. He could have driven back to the motel. Instead, he stayed. The small room behind the workshop had a cot, a wool blanket, and a narrow window facing the pines. Caleb built a modest fire in the hearth, ate cornbread from June's bag, and gave Sable the corner piece because dogs, unlike people, never pretended they were above bribery. Outside, snow began falling again. Not a storm, just a soft descent, white and patient, laying clean cloth over the world's unfinished business. Caleb lay on the cot, but did not sleep. The room was too quiet, and yet not empty. Every board seemed to hold a past footstep, every drawer a withheld sentence. The North Star offer lay folded on the desk outside. Mara's letters sat beneath Elias's legal pad. The steel door beneath the tarp waited in the barn like a sealed mouth. Near midnight, Caleb finally drifted into the thin sleep of men who listen even while dreaming. Sable rose. Caleb's eyes opened at once. The German shepherd stood in the doorway of the little room, body angled toward the main shop. His ears were high, his tail low, no bark, only that quiet sound in his throat. Caleb sat up. "Sable!" The dog moved. Caleb pulled on his boots and followed him through the dark workshop. Moonlight spilled through the windows, laying pale squares on the floor. The tools on the wall looked like sleeping instruments. The hearth gave one low red pulse. Sable went straight to the back door. Caleb took the flashlight from the hook and opened it. Cold breathed in. They crossed the yard to the storage barn. Snow tapped Caleb's shoulders, settled on Sable's black saddle, silvered the silver already there. The barn door groaned when Caleb pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder. Wood, dust, old hay, metal. And beneath it, something else. Thin, dry, chemical. Not strong enough to frighten a man. Strong enough to wake a dog who remembered. Sable stopped before the tarp-covered door. This time, Caleb did not hesitate. He took hold of the stiff canvas and pulled it fully aside. A low steel door stood revealed, set into a concrete frame at the base of the inner wall. Frost clung to its edges. The lock was old, heavy, not rusted through. On the frame, scratched by hand and partly filled with dust, were the words Caleb had only glimpsed the night before. "Do not seal what has not finished speaking." He read them once, then again. The sentence did not feel like a warning meant to scare him. It felt like a plea from someone too proud to beg while alive. Sable sat beside him, staring at the door. His breathing was slow, but his body was tight with alertness. Caleb crouched and touched the cold metal. No handle, no fresh marks, no sound from below. Only that faint chemical trace, old and buried, rising through the seam like a memory that had found one crack in the world. Caleb turned off the flashlight. Moonlight from the barn window fell across the door, across the carved words, across Sable's silver-marked back. For a long moment, man and dog stayed there without moving. Caleb had spent months trying not to be needed. Now an old woman's workshop, a suspicious land offer, a vanished name in medical papers, and a dog who remembered peppermint and smoke had all conspired to place one quiet burden at his feet. He did not open the door. Not yet. But he placed his palm against the steel as if answering a knock. "All right, Mara," he whispered. "I'm listening." Sable gave one low breath. The barn remained silent, but beneath the snow, the silence no longer felt empty. Caleb did not open the steel door that night. He stood with his palm against it until the cold climbed through his skin and settled in the bones of his hand. Sable remained beside him, quiet and watchful, his breath rising in pale clouds in the barn's dim moonlight. There were men who would have forced the lock right then, men who mistook urgency for courage. Caleb had known a few. Some had been brave, some had simply been loud. The difference was not always visible until something went wrong. Mara's words were scratched into the frame. "Do not seal what has not finished speaking. Not open, not break, not rush. Only do not seal." So Caleb did the one thing he had learned in places where one careless move could turn a bad situation worse. He stepped back. By morning, Elias Boone was standing in the storage barn with a thermos in one hand, a legal folder tucked under his arm, and a wool scarf wrapped so badly around his neck that it looked as though it had lost a fight. "You waited," Elias said. Caleb held up a ring of old keys he had found in Mara's desk after sunrise. Each was tagged in her narrow handwriting. "I'm trying a new hobby, not making everything worse. A refined pastime, rare in men over 40. Caleb handed him the key marked B Annex. Elias looked at the tag, then at the door. His humor thinned, though it did not vanish. Mara always did like naming things as if they were harmless. "What is it?" "A basement," Elias said. "Legally? And otherwise?" Elias did not answer immediately. Sable stood between them and the door, not blocking, simply present. Snowlight slipped through cracks in the barn siding and laid pale stripes across his black and tan coat. The crooked silver mark along his back shone faintly, like a river seen at night. "Otherwise," Elias said, "it may be the reason she trusted you with a mountain." Caleb fitted the key into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned with a heavy, reluctant click. The door opened inward. A breath of air came up from below, dry, chilled, chemical, but old. Not fresh danger, not rot, something preserved past its season. Concrete stairs descended into darkness. Caleb took a flashlight from his belt. Elias held up a small meter from his coat pocket. Caleb glanced at it. "Do you always carry that?" "No." Mara left it with instructions. "Carbon monoxide, low oxygen, volatile vapors. If it screams, we retreat with dignity. And if it doesn't? We retreat less dramatically." Caleb almost smiled. The meter stayed silent. They went down slowly, Caleb first, Sable close behind him, Elias following with one hand on the rail. The stairs were narrow but solid, poured concrete with metal edges. Someone had built this place properly. No cinematic cobweb tunnel, no hidden shrine, no underground palace for secrets. At the bottom, Caleb's light widened over a room about the size of a small classroom. It was cold, not freezing, but cold in a deliberate way, as if winter had been hired to stand guard. Metal cabinets lined one wall. A bank of old cold storage units sat along another, their indicator lights dark except for one weak green glow that blinked at long intervals. There were fireproof file safes, sealed storage boxes, a work table with an outdated microscope, a reel-to-reel recorder under a dust cover, and shelves of labeled binders. On the far wall, yellowing safety placards warned about ventilation, corrosive materials, and controlled access. Above the work table hung a chalkboard. Equations covered half of it, written in Mara's sharp, slanted hand. Arrows, abbreviations, compound identifiers, a phrase underlined twice. Inflammation is not the enemy. Unchecked fire is. Caleb swept the light over the room. Nothing moved. Nothing gleamed like treasure. Nothing promised miracles. The place looked less like a secret lab than a thought interrupted. "That's not what I expected," Caleb said. Elias exhaled. Neither was Mara, most days. Caleb walked toward the first file safe. His boots sounded too loud on the concrete floor. Sable followed him but stopped near the work table, nose lifting, then lowering toward a row of sealed trays inside a glass-fronted cold cabinet. The old clinical smell reached Caleb more clearly now. Antiseptic. Plastic, metal. A faint trace of chemical preservatives. Under it, the dusty mineral odor of concrete. His chest tightened. The room changed. Not fully, not like in the movies where the past arrives with thunder and smoke. It came sideways, the way memory often did. The cold cabinet became a supply rack. The work table became a field station. The hum in the walls became rotors. The smell of antiseptic opened a door in his body before his mind could lock it. His fingers stiffened. The flashlight beam dipped. For one terrible second, the floor beneath him was not Mara's annex. It was canvas over hard ground, heat outside, voices calling numbers. Someone asking for more time when time had already gone cruel. Caleb tried to breathe. His lungs took only half an order. Sable moved before Elias did. The German shepherd pressed his full weight against Caleb's left leg, firm enough to shift his balance. Then he pushed his head under Caleb's hand, forcing contact. Warm fur, real muscle, steady breath. Caleb closed his fingers in the silver-marked coat. Room beneath the barn. Pinecrest Ridge. Snow outside. Sable here, not there. Here. He bent slightly, one hand braced on Sable's back, the other on his own knee. Elias did not speak. That kindness mattered. Some men filled another man's panic with words because silence made them uncomfortable. Elias let the silence work. After a while, Caleb straightened. "I'm good," he said. "No," Elias replied gently, "but you're here." Caleb looked at him. Elias adjusted his crooked scarf with great dignity. Legal distinction. The smallest laugh escaped Caleb, dry and unwilling. It did not fix anything, but it returned the room to its proper shape. Sable stayed close. They began with the central table. Elias insisted on photographs before anything was moved. Caleb documented labels, dates, seals, cabinet numbers. He had spent enough years around medical supplies to respect chain of custody even before Elias used the phrase. They did not open sample containers. They did not disturb sealed trays. They read labels, copied numbers, and set aside only documents clearly meant for review. The first binder bore Mara's name. Doyle Neurologic Recovery Project, Phase 1 Archive, Adult Volunteer Cohort, Denver Neurorehabilitation Institute, 1988-1991. Caleb turned the pages slowly. The technical language was dense but not beyond him. He understood inflammation. He understood nerve trauma in practical terms, the way hands stopped obeying, the way pain could live in a body after the event had ended, the way recovery came like winter sunlight, thin and precious, through any crack it found. Mara's research centered on a compound designed to support myelin repair and reduce prolonged neuroinflammation after traumatic injury. Not a cure, not resurrection in a bottle. A helper. A narrow bridge across a very specific river. The early files were meticulous. Consent forms from adult volunteers, oversight signatures, safety notes, dose limitations, reports that did not hide uncertainties. Mara wrote in the margins with a kind of ferocious honesty. Promising is not proven. Hope must not be allowed to outrun evidence. Caleb stopped on that sentence. He thought of Holwick commercials, silver-haired couples in gardens, soft piano music, bottles turned toward the camera like holy relics. Hope there wore makeup and smiled on cue. Mara's Hope wore work gloves and wrote warnings in the margins. Elias opened another binder and went still. What? Elias turned the pages toward him. Letters, memos, internal reports copied on aging paper. Victor Arlen's name appeared beside Mara's in the earliest documents. His handwriting, neat and eager, filled the edges of several lab summaries. He had once argued for patience, for more review, for independent confirmation before publication. Then the tone shifted. Funding pressure, private development rights, proprietary formulation, accelerated commercialization pathways, redacted side effect summaries from adult trials of a derivative compound. Caleb felt anger come quietly, which was always the kind to watch. "She reported them," he said. Elias nodded. Repeatedly. There were letters Mara had sent to Holwick leadership, letters to review boards, letters to Victor himself. Caleb read part of one aloud. Victor, the foundation formula was developed under shared institutional oversight. You cannot alter the safety reports and call it innovation. You are not accelerating healing. You are outrunning accountability. Elias shut his eyes briefly. "You knew him?" Caleb asked. "I met him once at Mara's workshop years ago. He wore a coat that cost more than my first car and spoke as if every sentence had already been approved by a board." What did Mara do? Told him he had developed the tragic habit of mistaking polished shoes for moral progress. Despite himself, Caleb smiled. Then he looked at the next page. A formal memo from Holwick described Mara as emotionally volatile, professionally obstructive, and unable to adapt to modern research demands. The word struck him with unpleasant familiarity, not unstable, not exactly, but close enough. His own file had been dressed in better clothing. Phrases like concerns regarding stress tolerance, possible impairment under pressure, not advised for advisory reinstatement. No one had needed to call him broken. They only needed to write around the word until it stood in the room anyway. Caleb looked at Mara's name at the bottom of a letter. "She told the truth," he said, "so they made her sound unwell." Elias's voice was quiet. "That is a very old trick." Caleb thought of the Veterans Recovery Program, of the polite letter removing him, of the committee members who would not meet his eyes. He had believed, at least partly, that maybe they were right. Maybe his usefulness had ended in sand and rotor wash. Maybe the safest thing he could do for others was stay away. But Mara's papers sat before him, sharp and ordered and furious. How many people had been called unstable because they refused to lie gently? Sable nudged Caleb's hand. Caleb rested his fingers between the dog's ears. The room seemed to tilt again, but not toward the past this time, toward recognition. Mara had not left him a mystery because he was special. She had left it because he knew the shape of being dismissed by language too clean to argue with. At the back of the annex, beneath the chalkboard, sat a metal storage chest no larger than a toolbox. It was not hidden dramatically. No loose brick, no secret switch. It was labeled in Mara's own hand. If you are reading this because someone wants the basement sealed, begin here. Elias looked at Caleb. "Well," he said, "that is either helpful or extremely rude." Caleb crouched. The key ring held a smaller brass key tagged MVD Personal. The lock opened easily. Inside were 3 items wrapped in oilcloth: a stack of cassette tapes, a sealed envelope of data copies, and a photograph in a protective sleeve. Caleb lifted the photograph first. It showed a laboratory from decades earlier. Mara was younger, perhaps in her 40s, hair dark then, but already streaked silver at the temples. She stood beside Victor Arlen, who looked barely 30, handsome in the bright, unfinished way of ambitious men before they learned to hide hunger behind charm. They were laughing, not posing, laughing. Behind them, on a chalkboard, someone had written, "Healing belongs to the wounded first." Caleb studied Mara's face, not bitter, not suspicious, alive with the rare joy of being understood. Victor's shoulder angled toward her. His smile was open. It was the kind of image that made betrayal feel worse, because it proved there had once been something worth betraying. Elias looked at the picture and sighed. "What?" Caleb asked. "I hate photographs like that." "Why?" "Because villains rarely begin as villains, very inconvenient for paperwork." Caleb almost answered, but Sable moved closer, the dog's attention fixed on the lower corner of the photograph. Caleb tilted it toward the light. At first he saw only a blurred patch near a lab doorway. Then the shape clarified. A young German shepherd lying on a folded blanket, ears too large for its head, dark saddle markings across its back. A pale streak, not silver yet, but lighter than the rest, ran crookedly from the left shoulder toward the spine. Caleb looked down at Sable. The dog sat very still. His honey-brown eyes did not leave the picture. "That you?" Caleb asked softly. Sable's ears lowered by a fraction. No human answer came, of course. No miracle voice, no ghostly sign. Only the quiet weight of recognition in a creature who remembered the world through scent, tone, and touch. Elias leaned closer. "Mara mentioned a therapy dog once. Said he had better manners than every researcher in the building." "That narrows nothing." "No," Elias admitted. "Scientists are not known for manners." Caleb held the photograph lower. Sable leaned forward and touched the edge of the plastic sleeve with his nose. Then he exhaled. It was a small sound, almost nothing, but Caleb felt it move through him. Years before Caleb had inherited the workshop, years before he had joked about moon-brushed wolves in a motel room, Mara had known this dog, or at least a younger version of him. She had sat somewhere near him, spoken to him, maybe wrapped that blue blanket over his healing back, maybe called him the moon-brushed one first. The past did not rise like a monster from the basement. It rose like a thread, soft, persistent, harder to break than rope. Elias carefully placed the cassette tapes into an evidence sleeve he had brought. "We need to digitize these without damaging them, and copy every document in here before anyone knows exactly what exists." Caleb looked around the cold annex. What about the will condition, the snow thawing twice? Elias closed the metal chest, but did not lock it yet. "Mara's idea. I helped make the language boring enough to survive court." "Why twice?" "First thaw checks the ground and runoff. If anything in this annex leaked during freeze, it would show in meltwater patterns and soil tests. Mara did not want anyone claiming she hid an environmental hazard." "And the second?" "That gives my office time to activate a trust protocol if the basement is threatened. If a third party tries to seal, demolish, or take control prematurely, duplicate packets go to an independent research ethics committee, a university archive, and one very humorless regulatory attorney in Denver." Caleb stared at him. Elias adjusted his glasses. "Mara believed in belts, suspenders, and a spare pair of pants. She could have told me." "She did," Elias said, in the only way she thought might survive her. Caleb looked again at the chalkboard, the cabinets, the labels, the photograph of a woman laughing before the world learned how to erase her. For the first time, the annex did not feel like a buried secret. It felt like testimony. They spent another hour documenting without opening sealed materials. Caleb found a recorder but did not play the tapes. Elias insisted they wait until the tapes could be transferred safely. Caleb agreed, though part of him wanted to hear Mara's voice so badly it surprised him. The longing made no sense. He had barely known her. Yet somehow, beneath a mountain, surrounded by her handwriting and her stubborn warnings, Caleb felt closer to Mara than he had felt to people who had sat across from him at family tables for years. Maybe kinship was not always built by time. Maybe sometimes it waited in the one sentence that recognized your wound without naming it aloud. Before leaving, Caleb copied one line from Mara's margin into his pocket notebook. Hope must not be allowed to outrun evidence. Then he added beneath it, without knowing why, but evidence should not be buried because hope makes cowards uncomfortable. He showed Elias. The old lawyer read it and nodded once. Careful, Mr. Doyle. That is almost a thesis. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation for avoiding those. They climbed the stairs near dusk. The barn above was full of amber light. Snow beyond the open door had turned blue in the shadows and gold where the sun struck it. The world looked impossibly clean for a place that could hide so much. At the top, Sable stopped and looked back down into the annex. Caleb waited. The dog did not growl now. He did not warn. He simply stood, head lowered, as if acknowledging someone left below. Caleb placed a hand on his back. "We'll come back," he said. Sable turned toward him. Together they closed the steel door. Not sealed. Closed. There was a difference, and Caleb understood now why Mara had cared. In the workshop, Elias packed the first documents into his briefcase and locked the metal chest in a fireproof cabinet upstairs until they could move it properly. No drama, no grand declaration, only careful hands doing careful work. Before Elias left, he paused at the door. "Caleb?" Caleb looked up. "This will not stay quiet forever." "I know. When it stops being quiet, they will not attack the documents first. They will attack the person holding them." Caleb glanced at Sable, who sat near the hearth with the old blue blanket under his front paws. "Then we make sure I'm not holding them alone." Elias's expression softened. Mara did choose well. Caleb looked away. Compliments still felt like coats cut for another man. Outside, evening settled over Pinecrest Ridge. Smoke lifted from chimneys below. The mountain wore snow like an old god pretending to sleep. Caleb stood in the workshop after Elias's car disappeared down the road. The room smelled of wood oil and cold air. Sable came to his side and leaned against him, not because Caleb was falling now, but because both of them had been handed the edge of something heavy. On the workbench lay the photograph in its sleeve. Mara and Victor laughing. A young dog in the corner, the chalkboard words behind them. Caleb picked it up one last time before placing it with the files. "Healing belongs to the wounded first," he read softly. Sable's ears flicked. Caleb looked toward the storage barn. Below it, the annex waited beneath snow and timber and years of silence. It held no magic cure, no buried fortune, no simple victory. Only a trail of careful evidence, a woman's erased name, and the first hard proof that sometimes the past did not haunt a man to punish him. Sometimes it came back because it needed a witness. Caleb set the photograph down. "All right," he said to Mara, to Sable, to the room, and perhaps to the part of himself he had left buried under other people's clean words. "We'll witness." North Star Land and Timber did not arrive with threats. Threats would have been honest. Instead, they arrived first by mail. The first envelope came on thick paper, the color of fresh cream, with Caleb's name printed in dark green ink and the North Star logo stamped above it. A pine tree, a mountain ridge, and a rising sun so tasteful it looked guilty of nothing. Inside was a letter thanking him for his thoughtful consideration of their offer, though Caleb had not considered it thoughtfully so much as folded it and wished it would stop existing. Then came the brochure. It was full of smiling older adults in wool sweaters gazing through enormous windows at snowy peaks. A woman held a mug with both hands and looked healed by chamomile. A silver-haired man sat in a cedar sauna as if he had personally forgiven winter. There were phrases like restorative solitude, mountain-based wellness, legacy-minded development, and responsible environmental stewardship. Caleb read that last one twice. Responsible environmental stewardship, apparently, was what people called it when they offered 7 times the value of a dead woman's land before the snow had finished settling on her grave. June Harlow had looked at the brochure over the diner counter and snorted so hard her coffee almost changed cups. "Look at that," she said, tapping the page with one blunt finger. They found 6 people who smile while sitting on uncomfortable furniture. Elias Boone examined the same brochure later at Mara's workbench and said, "The paper quality alone should be entered into evidence." Caleb did not laugh as much as they wanted him to. He had seen this kind of kindness before. Not in brochures exactly, but in rooms where polished people said troubling things with gentle voices. Rooms where a man's service record could be praised in one paragraph and used against him in the next. Rooms where someone slid a pen across a table and called "surrender a transition plan." North Star did not sound dangerous. That was why Caleb distrusted them. For 3 days, the workshop remained quiet. Caleb and Elias photographed documents, labeled copies, and kept the metal chest from the cold annex locked in the fireproof cabinet upstairs. They had not yet played Mara's cassette tapes. Elias insisted on transferring them properly first, and Caleb, though impatient, agreed. Evidence was a fragile animal. It could be harmed by anger as easily as by malice. Sable kept his routines. At dawn, he walked the perimeter fence with Caleb. At noon, he slept near the hearth, one paw often touching the old blue blanket. At night, he stationed himself where he could see both the workshop door and the path to the storage barn. Not a guard dog in the simple sense, more like a keeper of thresholds. On the 4th morning, the white world was painfully bright. Snow clung to the pines, and the sky over Pinecrest Ridge was a hard blue bowl. Caleb was sanding the edge of an unfinished therapy bench when tires crunched up the drive. Sable lifted his head. He did not rise yet. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans and looked through the east window. A white SUV had stopped beside the fence. Clean. Too clean for a mountain road in winter. 3 people stepped out wearing matching field jackets in muted gray-green, the kind of clothing designed to imply practicality while never having met a splinter. The woman in front carried a tablet. She was in her 40s. Blonde hair tucked under a knit cap, face composed around a professional smile. Behind her came a tall man with a trimmed beard and a hard-shell equipment case. The third was younger, narrow-shouldered, wearing new gloves that shone slightly in the sun. He kept glancing at the storage barn. Caleb saw that before he saw anything else. He opened the door before they knocked. "Mr. Doyle?" the woman asked. "That depends on who's asking." Her smile adjusted, not vanished, adjusted. "I'm Claire Whitcomb, Environmental Assessment Coordinator with Green Line Compliance Services. We've been contracted by North Star Land and Timber to conduct a preliminary site safety review." Caleb looked at the embroidered patch on her jacket. Green line, leaf logo, neutral colors, soft words. "You're early. We emailed notice." "I don't live in my email." The bearded man shifted his case from one hand to the other. The younger one looked past Caleb toward the interior of the shop. Claire kept smiling. "Of course, we apologize for any inconvenience. This is Dr. Mason Vale, field chemist, and Tyler Rusk, environmental technician. We're not here to disturb anything, just to confirm whether the outbuildings contain any materials that would require containment before property transfer." "There is no property transfer." "Not yet," Claire said smoothly. "But responsible assessment often begins before final decisions." Caleb had to admire the sentence. It had no sharp edges and nowhere to put a fist. Sable appeared beside him then, silent as a verdict. Tyler Rusk took half a step back. Dr. Vale did not. He looked at Sable the way a man looked at a locked door he planned to open later. Caleb noticed that too. "I'll need to see identification," Caleb said. Claire produced documents. They looked correct at a glance. Company letterhead, liability language, North Star authorization, dates, signatures. Everything nearly clean enough to be true. Nearly. Caleb thought of Elias's warning. If they arrive smiling, record before answering. He had placed a small camera on the shelf above the front window that morning, angled toward the main room. His phone was already recording in his shirt pocket. "Main workshop only," Caleb said. "No basement, no storage annex, no sealed areas. Anything beyond that requires my attorney present." Claire's smile thinned at the word attorney. "Of course." They entered. The workshop changed as they did. It did not become frightened. It became alert. Dust glowed in the winter light. Tools hung with their quiet old authority. Sable went to the space beside Caleb's workbench and lay down, but his head remained raised. Claire walked slowly, tablet in hand, narrating observations in a soft voice. Woodworking materials, natural oils, possible solvents, old heating system, no active production. Mason Vale opened his case and removed a handheld sensor. He was a neat man, in his late 30s or early 40s, black beard trimmed close, eyes pale and quick. His gloves were worn at the fingertips, unlike Tyler's. He knew equipment. He knew rooms. That did not comfort Caleb. Tyler moved with the nervous eagerness of someone trying to prove he belonged where he had been sent. His jacket still held creases from shipping. His gloves were new, bright blue beneath the cuffs, and when he passed the cabinet where Mara's old chemical safety logs were stored, Sable's nose lifted. Caleb saw the dog's nostrils work. Then Sable stood. No growl. No bark, only a rise from the floor, slow and deliberate, like a gate being raised in reverse. Tyler stopped near the back hallway, leading toward the barn access. "Please remain in the marked workspace," Caleb said. Tyler gave a quick smile. "Just checking airflow paths." "The airflow can wait for my lawyer." Claire turned. "Mr. Doyle, if there is a known lower-level storage area, our report should include—" "Your report can include that access was denied pending counsel. That may complicate North Star's risk assessment." "Good." June would have been proud of that one. Tyler's hands flexed. Sable walked toward him, not fast. The dog's eyes fixed on Tyler's gloves. He sniffed once from 3 feet away and stopped. The ridge of fur along his neck lifted slightly, but he remained silent. Mason Vale watched Sable, then Tyler. For the first time, Caleb saw a crack in the group's smoothness. "What are you carrying?" Caleb asked. Tyler looked down. "Standard sampling swabs." "Show me." Claire stepped in. "Mr. Doyle, our staff are certified." "Then they can show me certified empty hands." The bearded chemist cleared his throat. "Tyler." Tyler opened one pouch on his belt. Swabs, vials, a small flashlight. His right glove, however, held a faint sheen across 2 fingers. Sable leaned forward and made a low sound in his throat. Not enough to frighten anyone outside the room. Enough to change the air. Caleb smelled it then. Sharp, clean, new. Not the old dry trace from the cold annex. Not linseed oil. Not peppermint. Not wood dust. A solvent smell, thin but fresh, clinging to Tyler's glove like a secret badly washed. Caleb's pulse slowed. That was the old training returning. Not panic, not anger. The clean, cold attention that arrived when something needed to be handled exactly. "We're done for today," he said. Claire blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Assessment is over. We haven't inspected the barn." "And you won't." Claire's professional warmth cooled by several degrees. "Refusal may be documented." "Document it beautifully." For a moment, no one moved. Then Mason Vale closed his case. He did it calmly, but he did not look pleased with Tyler. They left behind polite words, a business card, and the faint scent of something Caleb did not want anywhere near Mara's evidence. When the SUV drove away, Caleb locked the door. Sable did not relax. He went straight to the cabinet beneath the south workbench and began pawing at the baseboard. Sable? The dog pawed again, sharper this time. Caleb crouched. At first, the cabinet looked ordinary. 2 drawers, lower compartment, old brass pulls. Then he saw the seam. Too straight, too fine. Mara had built secrets the way she built handrails, practical, precise, and unwilling to announce themselves. Caleb pressed along the lower trim until something clicked. A narrow panel sprang loose. Inside was a shallow compartment holding a sealed envelope, a key, and a handwritten instruction card. Caleb read it with the strange feeling that Mara had reached through the wood and tapped him on the forehead. If an outside environmental party attempts premature containment, move countersamples and recordings to secondary fire, safe behind north wall brace. Photograph all seals before relocation. Do not argue with men who smell like fresh solvent. They came prepared to be believed. Caleb sat back on his heels. For several seconds, he did not move. Sable stood beside him, close enough that Caleb felt the dog's warmth. Mara had known, not the exact day, not the exact faces, but she had known the shape of what would come. Paperwork first, concern second, containment third, silence last. Caleb's first instinct was to call Elias. His second was to call June and ask if all dead women in Pinecrest Ridge were this bossy. He did both in that order. By dusk, Elias had arrived with extra evidence bags, a portable scanner, and an expression that suggested his worst suspicions had insulted him by being correct. June arrived 20 minutes later with soup, coffee, and a look at Caleb that said she had already decided this was partly his fault for answering the door like a reasonable person. "Fresh solvent," Elias muttered, reading Mara's card. "She really did write that?" "Apparently, I'm taking instructions from beyond the grave," Caleb said. June set down the thermos. "There are worse managers. They documented everything, every seal, every label, every movement from one cabinet to another." Caleb found the secondary fire safe behind the north wall brace exactly where Mara said it would be. It was hidden behind a removable plank marked by a knot in the shape of a crooked heart. "Subtle," Elias said. June peered at it. Mara's idea of subtle was putting the secret behind something obvious and trusting fools to look for drama elsewhere. By 9, the essential countersamples and cassette tapes were secured in the secondary safe. Elias took digital copies of the visible logs and left with one encrypted drive tucked into his briefcase, muttering about injunctions, trespass, and the declining moral fiber of private contractors. Caleb stayed at the workshop again, not because he was brave, because leaving felt too much like handing the place over to its enemies. The night was blue with moonlight. Snow lay smooth across the yard, unbroken except for the tracks from Elias's tires, June's boots, and Sable's patrol. Caleb kept the workshop lights off except for one lamp near the hearth. He sat at Mara's bench with his coat on, listening. Sable lay near the door to the barn path. At 11:42, the dog lifted his head. Caleb did not speak. The sound came a moment later. Tires far down the drive, engine low, lights cut before reaching the fence. Caleb's hand went to his phone. He texted Elias first. "They're back." Then he activated the camera on his phone and slipped it into the chest pocket of his flannel, lens facing outward. His heartbeat remained steady, though his hands were cold. That steadiness did not feel heroic. It felt borrowed from the man he had once been in emergencies, the man who could still count, assess, and move. Sable rose. "No barking," Caleb whispered. The dog glanced at him with mild offense, as if barking had been an amateur suggestion. They moved through the dark workshop together. Moonlight silvered the tools on the wall. The unfinished braces and chairs became pale shapes in the shadows, like a gathering of quiet witnesses. Caleb went out the side door and stayed close to the wall, where the overhang kept snow from crunching beneath his boots. 3 figures crossed the yard toward the storage barn. Not Claire. Mason Vale was there, carrying his equipment case. Tyler, too, moving stiffly, glancing over his shoulder. The third man wore a dark cap and carried a small metal canister. Caleb kept filming. They entered the barn through the side door Tyler had studied earlier. Caleb waited 5 seconds, then followed. Inside, the barn was dim and blue. The men used narrow flashlights pointed down, trying not to spill light through the gaps in the siding. Mason knelt near the tarp-covered steel door. Tyler stood watch badly. The third man set the canister near the ventilation intake that led below. Caleb felt anger rise. Not hot. Heavy. They were not here to discover danger. They had brought it with them. Mason opened his case and removed tubing. Caleb shifted to get a clearer angle. His boot touched a loose nail. The sound was tiny. Tyler turned. Sable stepped out of the shadows first. He did not run. He did not attack. He simply appeared between Caleb and the men, black and gold body low, ears forward, eyes bright in the moonlight. Tyler made a strangled sound and dropped his flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor and landed on Sable's silver-streaked back. For one strange moment, the dog looked carved from night and winter fire. Caleb stepped forward, phone raised. "Leave it where it is." Mason froze. The third man reached toward the canister. Caleb's voice stayed level. "I'm recording. The sheriff has been notified. So has my attorney." That was only half true. Elias had been notified. The sheriff had not yet. But truth, Caleb had learned, sometimes needed a few seconds to catch up. The third man withdrew his hand. Mason looked at Tyler, then at Caleb. His expression was not fear. It was calculation, and calculation could be more dangerous. "You're misunderstanding a safety intervention," Mason said. "At midnight," Caleb replied, "with your headlights off." Mason's mouth closed. Sable gave one low sound. Not a threat. A period at the end of Caleb's sentence. Caleb moved along the wall toward the manual ventilation control box Mara had marked in one of her diagrams. He opened it, gripped the old lever, and pulled it down. The vent shutter clanged shut beneath the floor. The third man swore softly. Caleb kept the phone steady. "Now you can explain your safety intervention to Sheriff Cross." This time, he called her. Nadine Cross arrived 11 minutes later in a brown Sheriff's Department SUV that came up the road with all its lights on and no interest in subtlety. She stepped into the barn wearing a heavy winter uniform jacket, hair pulled low at the back of her neck, dark gloves tucked under one arm. She was in her early 50s, square-faced, steady-eyed, with the posture of a woman who had never once been improved by nonsense. Her gaze moved from Caleb to Sable, to the 3 men, to the canister near the vent. Then she looked back at Caleb. "This," she said, "better not be as stupid as it looks." "It's probably worse," Caleb said. Nadine's eyes narrowed. That was not an invitation to be poetic. Elias arrived shortly after, scarf even worse than in the morning, briefcase in hand, expression bright with legal outrage. He moved carefully over the snow and entered the barn like an elderly fox, walking into a henhouse with paperwork. "I advise Mr. Doyle to document any unauthorized attempt to access restricted areas," Elias said. Nadine looked at him. "Of course you did." "Sheriff Cross," he said, "always a pleasure to meet under preventable circumstances." "Elias?" There was history there. Caleb did not need details. The tone said enough. Old town, old cases, old arguments, neither had entirely lost. Nadine took statements. She photographed the canister, the vent, the footprints, the side door, the dropped flashlight. Caleb showed the video from the afternoon and the night. Elias produced the will, the property documents, and Mara's written emergency instruction card. At first, Nadine's face remained guarded. Caleb understood. His record had cracks in it, not criminal cracks. Not shameful ones, though the world enjoyed treating them that way. Medical ones, stress ones, words that could be pulled into a room and made to dance badly under fluorescent light. Men like him were often believed only after evidence had grown tired of being ignored. Then Sable walked to the place where Tyler had stood that afternoon and sniffed the floor. He moved to the canister, then to the glove Tyler had stuffed halfway into his jacket pocket. He sat. Nadine noticed. "Glove," she said. Tyler looked around. "What?" "Right pocket. Take it out. Slowly." He did. The same sharp solvent smell cut the air when the glove emerged. Nadine's expression changed. Not much, only enough. But the room felt it. She looked at Mason Vale. "You want to explain why your technician's glove smells like the material in that container?" Mason said nothing. Elias smiled faintly. It was not a friendly expression. Nadine turned to Caleb. "I can't give you Hallowik on a platter." "I didn't ask for that." "Good, because I don't carry platters. What I can do is write this as unauthorized entry, attempted access to a restricted structure, and possible contamination risk. I can secure the scene pending a formal environmental review with county oversight." Elias cleared his throat. "And independent observation." Nadine pointed at him without looking. "Don't help me talk." "Yes, ma'am." Caleb looked toward the steel door. The canister sat near the closed vent, useless now, a small thing, a prevented thing, not victory. A hand placed over a candle before the wind could find it. By the time the three men were escorted from the property and Nadine finished her first report, it was past 2 in the morning. The moon had lowered behind the pines. Snow glittered under the sheriff's headlights. Elias stood near his car, calling someone in a voice full of courteous menace. Nadine remained at the barn door with Caleb. "You always this popular?" she asked. "Only since inheriting basements." Her mouth twitched once. "That dog trained?" "Yes." "Therapy? Military therapy program?" "Smart." "He thinks so." Nadine looked down at Sable. "Officer Sable, you may be the most reliable witness here." Sable blinked with grave acceptance of promotion. Caleb almost smiled, but the feeling did not last. After everyone left, the workshop felt larger than before. Too large. Caleb built a small fire in the hearth because his hands had started to shake. Not violently, just enough to make lighting the match irritating. He sat on the floor rather than the chair, back against the stone hearth, knees bent, flannel sleeves still rolled to the elbows, as if some part of him expected to be called back into motion. Sable came and lay beside him. For a while, Caleb said nothing. The fire took slowly, then found itself. Orange light moved over the tools, the drawings, the hidden cabinets, the old blue blanket. Outside, tire tracks cut dark lines through the snow. "I think she chose wrong," Caleb said at last. Sable shifted his head. Caleb stared at the flames. "Mara, Elias, whoever decided I was the one for this?" The dog placed his muzzle on Caleb's wrist. Caleb looked down. Sable gave a long breath through his nose, a sound so weary and patient it might have belonged to every good dog who had ever watched a man accuse himself of failing before the real work began. Caleb let his hand rest against the dog's face. "You disagree?" Sable closed his eyes. In the firelight, the silver mark along his back glowed like a thin piece of moon laid across fur. Caleb remembered the photograph in the cold annex, the younger dog at the edge of the frame, Mara laughing beside the man who would one day try to erase her. Maybe Mara had not chosen Caleb because he was whole. Maybe she had chosen him because he knew what it meant to be misfiled as damaged and still remain useful. Outside, the mountain kept its old counsel. The snow covered the tracks slowly, not hiding them completely, only softening their edges until morning could judge them more clearly. Caleb sat with Sable beside the fire until the shaking passed. He did not feel brave, but the steel door was still closed, not sealed. The samples were safe. The tapes were safe. And for the first time since the letter arrived at room 6, Caleb understood that protecting Mara's truth would not be a single grand act. It would be a series of small, stubborn refusals. Refusing to sign, refusing to rush, refusing to let polite men carry silence into the barn and call it safety. Sable lifted his head and looked toward the dark window, where the moon had left only its reflection on the snow. Caleb followed his gaze. The workshop, once quiet as a held breath, now seemed awake in every beam and nail, not frightened, waiting. Caleb had learned long ago that truth was not safe simply because it was true. In the field, a man could shout that he was fine while his pulse told another story. In boardrooms, people could praise service while preparing to file it under liability. In a laboratory, Caleb was beginning to understand, numbers could be moved by hands that never trembled. So he did not take Mara's files to the nearest camera. He did not call a reporter. He did not stand in front of the workshop with a box of papers and declare war on Hollowick Pharma like some mountain prophet in a flannel coat. Mara's work was unfinished. The compound she had studied was not a miracle, not a cure, not a promise wrapped in glass. If the story broke too soon, it would become a spectacle before it became evidence. People would argue over hope before anyone protected the data. Hollowick would call it confusion. Northstar would call it contamination. Someone would call Caleb unstable. He knew how quickly one word could be made to carry an entire coffin. So the morning after Sheriff Nadine Cross secured the barn, Caleb sat at Mara's main workbench with Elias Boone, June Harlow, 3 sealed storage boxes, 2 thermoses of coffee, 1 pot of stew, and Sable stretched across the floor like a black and gold guardian of inconvenient paperwork. Elias had cleared a space with almost ceremonial care. "Evidence," he said, placing labels along the bench, "is like a cat. It may belong to you, but it will ruin your life if handled without respect." June set down a loaf of bread hard enough to be structurally useful. "That is the first sensible thing you've said before noon." "My dear June, I am sensible constantly. Others lack the training to appreciate it." Sable lifted his head and looked at Elias. Elias pointed at the dog. Objection noted. Caleb was too tired to laugh properly, but the sound that left him was close enough that June looked satisfied. The workshop had changed again. In Chapter 1 of his Inheritance, though Caleb would never have phrased it so grandly, the place had been a silent question. In the days after, it had become a memory house, full of Mara's hand and Sable's recognition. Now it had become something more practical, an evidence room with snowlight, soup, and a retired lawyer whose cookies should have been classified as blunt objects. On the far side of the bench, Mara's files lay in careful stacks, research drafts, safety logs, copies of letters to Hollowick, photographs of the cold annex, notes on the attempted environmental assessment, Nadine's preliminary report. The chain of custody was beginning to look like a bridge, not a beautiful bridge perhaps, more like one built in a storm with stubborn hands and too much coffee, but it crossed something dangerous. Elias tapped a name written on a yellow legal pad. Dr. Helena Voss. Caleb looked up. Who is she? A research ethics specialist in Denver, former University Review Board chair, consultant on clinical misconduct cases, not easily impressed, not cheaply bought, and not fond of men who use Latin to hide bad behavior. June leaned against the counter. Sounds like Mara would either adore her or try to fight her with a salad fork. Both can be true, Elias said. Caleb studied the name. He disliked bringing strangers into the workshop. Every new person meant another mouth for the secret to escape through, another pair of eyes that might see his record before seeing the documents. Yet he also knew his limits. He could read medical procedures. He could preserve evidence. He could recognize the smell of a lie. But he was not a neurologic researcher, and Mara had not spent years warning people about reckless hope only for Caleb to become reckless with hers. "Call her," he said. Elias already had. Dr. Helena Voss arrived the next afternoon in a dark blue parka dusted with snow, carrying a locked document case and wearing the expression of a woman who had spent her adult life separating urgency from panic. She was 54, tall and spare, with a straight posture and black hair streaked with silver, cut in a precise bob just below her jaw. Her eyes were gray, cool, and focused. Not unkind, but not offering comfort before facts had earned it. Caleb met her at the workshop door. Sable stood beside him. Helena looked first at Caleb's face, then at his hands, then at the dog. "Dr. Voss," Caleb said. "Mr. Doyle." Her handshake was firm and brief. She did not overdo it, which Caleb appreciated. Inside, she removed her gloves, opened her case, and began not by reading the most dramatic letter, but by asking for the dullest things. Dates of access, Elias provided them. Photographic sequence, Caleb laid out the printed copies. Original storage locations. Logged, Elias said. Who moved the tapes? Mr. Doyle and myself after photographing seals. Who witnessed? June Harlow for relocation, Sheriff Cross for attempted access report. Helena's gaze shifted to Caleb. Why did you not notify federal authorities immediately? The question had no accusation in its tone. That made it harder. Caleb took a slow breath. Sable moved closer, shoulder touching his leg. Local law enforcement doesn't have the technical scope. Hallowick has attorneys who could bury this under contamination claims before anyone reads the first file. And my own history can be used to make the whole thing sound like... He stopped. Like what? Helena asked. Like a symptom. The workshop fell quiet. June looked down at the coffee pot. Elias's face tightened, but he said nothing. Helena held Caleb's gaze for a long moment. Then, for the first time since entering, something human moved behind her guarded eyes. Your medical file has been used against your credibility? Yes. In formal proceedings? Yes. She looked toward the stacks of Mara's letters. Then you understand one of the oldest forms of institutional cowardice. Caleb did not answer. Helena sat at the bench. When I was 27, she said, I read a paper by Dr. Mara V. Doyle on inflammatory response modulation in nerve recovery. It was careful work, too careful to be glamorous. A few years later, similar language appeared under Halwick-funded publications. Victor Arlen's name remained. Mara's disappeared. Elias leaned forward. You noticed? I noticed enough to be uneasy, not enough to prove anything. At that age, unease is often mistaken for inexperience, especially when the room is full of men with titles. June made a low sound. Mara would have liked that sentence. I am not certain Mara liked anyone without testing them first, Helena said. That was when Caleb began to trust her, not fully. Trust was not a light switch in him. It was an old stove that needed coaxing. But Helena did not come looking for a hero or a headline. She came looking for structure. She demanded proof before sympathy. In Caleb's experience, that was often the beginning of real kindness. For hours, Helena reviewed the files. She worked silently, marking pages with blue tabs, photographing document seals, checking dates against publication timelines. Sable lay between two file boxes, his front paws crossed. Every so often, he shifted one paw onto a folder Caleb had not yet opened, which made Elias whisper, If he passes the bar, I refuse to work under him. June brought stew at 4 o'clock, bread at 5, and coffee at 6. Caleb said the coffee was strong enough to polish engine parts. June replied, "It is the only thing keeping middle-aged men from drowning in noble self-pity." "I'm not drowning." "You're waiting with intent." Helena, without looking up from a memo, said, "That is diagnostically vivid." June pointed at her. "I like this one." By evening, the workshop no longer felt like Caleb's burden alone. It had become a small council under winter light. The lawyer, the scientist, the diner owner, the former medic, and the old dog whose silver-marked back rose and fell between the evidence boxes like a sleeping oath. Then came Ruth Bellamy. She did not knock so much as announce war on the door with her cane. Caleb opened it to find a woman in her late 50s standing on the porch, short and solid, wearing an olive field jacket over a gray Henley, a burnt-orange scarf, and boots dusted with snow. Her hair was cropped close in salt and pepper. Her face looked carved by weather and suspicion. In one hand she held a walnut cane with a small hawk carved into the handle. "You Doyle?" she asked. "Yes." "Ruth Bellamy." Caleb waited. She looked past him into the workshop. "June said you haven't sold yet." From inside, June called, "I said he had not yet committed a major moral failure. There's a difference." Ruth's mouth twitched, though no smile arrived. "Mara made me this cane, and the rails in my house, and a bench I pretend not to need." Caleb stepped aside. "Come in." Ruth entered as if crossing a border she did not trust. Her eyes moved over the tools, the hearth, the boxes, Caleb's face. Then she saw Sable. The dog rose. For the first time since Caleb had known him, Sable's composure altered in a way that was almost youthful. Not excitement exactly. A loosening? His ears tipped forward, and his tail moved once, slowly. Ruth stopped. "Well," she said quietly, "there's the moon-backed boy." Caleb felt the room pull tight around those words. June looked at him. Elias stopped writing. Helena, who missed very little, turned in her chair. "You knew Sable?" Caleb asked. Ruth leaned on her cane. "Not his name. Mara never told me that. But I remember the dog. Therapy program brought him up after an accident with a chemical cleaning agent." "Minor," they said. "Minor always means someone wants you to stop asking questions." Sable walked to Ruth and sniffed the carved hawk on her cane. Ruth let him. "Mara kept him here for weeks," she said. "Made a raised cot so he didn't have to lie on the cold floor. Sat by that hearth and talked to him like he was a colonel who had seen too much." Caleb looked at the blue blanket. Ruth followed his gaze. That was his. The sentence landed softly, but it changed the room. Caleb had spent days wondering whether Sable's reactions were memory or only scent, training, coincidence. Ruth's words did not make it mystical. They made it more powerful. The dog had not been chasing ghosts. He had come back to a place where someone once treated his wound as a chapter, not a conclusion. Ruth looked at Caleb then. Her eyes were not soft, but they were no longer closed. "Mara didn't leave this place to a lucky man," she said. "She left it to someone who knew what it felt like to be called broken." Caleb could have rejected the sentence. Once he might have. He might have hidden behind sarcasm or looked away until the moment passed. Instead, he stood still. Sable pressed his head briefly against Caleb's hand. Ruth noticed and nodded, as if that confirmed a report only she had been reading. That night, they had enough people around Mara's bench to make the workshop feel less like a hiding place and more like a stubborn little court convened by the dead. Helena's findings were careful and therefore more troubling. The early data sets attributed to Mara and Arlen match formulation notes in these binders, she said. Later Halwick reports appear to use the same foundational structure but change safety language around adverse responses in adult trial participants. June folded her arms. "In English, please." In English, Helena said, someone made concerning results sound less concerning. Elias leaned back. And attribution? Mara's authorship is clear in early drafts and institutional submissions. Later documents reduce her role. Eventually, remove it. Caleb looked at the photograph of Mara and Victor laughing. And Victor knew? Helena did not answer quickly. That is the gap, she said. We can show that Halwick benefited from Mara's work. We can show suspicious alterations. We can show she objected. But to prove Victor knowingly moved forward using her foundation before Halwick registered derivative patents, we need internal confirmation. An email, Elias said, a memo, a routing log, an archive reference, something from inside. Ruth tapped her cane once against the floor. Companies always keep copies. They just bury them where decent people can't reach without getting dirty. Elias looked at a stack of older correspondence. Mara wrote to someone besides Victor. He adjusted his glasses and pulled a thin carbon copy from a folder. Martin Keene, Halwick Data Archives. Helena's head lifted slightly. You know the name? Caleb asked. Archivist, records integrity. Retired, I believe. Very old school. The sort of person institutions depend on and then forget. Elias checked a note in his folder. Grand Junction address. Landline, too, if the angels of obsolete technology still favor us. June put fresh coffee in front of Caleb. Call him. Caleb looked at the number. The day had been full of evidence and old recognition. Yet somehow this frightened him more than the cold annex. Papers did not tremble when cornered. People did. He dialed. The phone rang 5 times. A man answered with a voice thin as old paper. Hello? Mr. Keene, my name is Caleb Doyle. I'm calling about Dr. Mara V. Doyle. Silence, not confusion. Withdrawal. I don't know that name, the man said. Caleb glanced at Elias, who shook his head slightly, urging patience. She wrote to you in 1992 about Halwick Research Archives. I said I don't know that name. His voice had hardened, but beneath it, Caleb heard something else. Not anger. Fear trained over many years to sound like irritation. I'm not calling to accuse you. You shouldn't call here. Mr. Keene, no, whatever this is, whatever you found, leave me out of it. Caleb's hand tightened around the phone. Sable rose and came to his side. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Room, workshop, snow, dog. I have Mara's files, he said, and her tapes. The breath on the other end changed. Very small. But there, Martin Keene said nothing. Mara's name was taken off work that belonged to her, Caleb continued. If you know anything that can help us prove it, now is the time. A clock ticked somewhere on the line. Or perhaps Caleb imagined it. When Martin spoke again, his voice was lower. Is the dog alive? Caleb looked down at Sable. The German shepherd stared toward the phone, ears forward. What dog? The one with the pale mark. Martin swallowed audibly. Mara's moonback dog. Caleb felt every person in the room go still. He's alive, Caleb said. Another silence. Then Martin whispered, God forgive me, and hung up. Caleb stood with the receiver still in his hand. No one spoke for a while. It was June who finally broke the silence. Well, she said, though her voice had softened, that man is carrying a whole attic full of trouble. Elias took off his glasses and cleaned them with his handkerchief. And now we know he remembers the stairs to it. Helena looked at Caleb. Do not pressure him recklessly. Fear can destroy evidence faster than anger. Caleb nodded. Ruth leaned on her cane. But don't let him crawl back under the floorboards either. Outside, twilight had turned the snow a deepening blue. Sable moved to the window and stood looking toward the dark line of road beyond the pines, as if he could hear an old man's conscience traveling somewhere in the cold. Caleb thought the day was done. It was not. The call came after Ruth left, after Helena packed her case, after June began wrapping leftover bread in wax paper as if feeding people were a military operation. The number was unknown. Caleb answered on the third ring. "Mr. Doyle," said a man's voice, smooth and pleasant. "My name is Richard Pell. I represent interests connected to North Star Land and Timber." Caleb looked at Elias. The lawyer's expression sharpened. "What do you want?" Caleb asked. "To correct the tone of recent misunderstandings. North Star remains committed to resolving this matter in a way that protects all parties." "You broke into my barn." "I would caution against inflammatory descriptions." Caleb almost laughed, the kind of laugh that did not carry humor. Pell continued. "There is an opportunity here for discretion, a revised purchase agreement, significantly increased compensation, a non-disparagement clause, confidentiality. You walk away with financial security. The property is professionally remediated. The past is allowed to rest." Caleb looked through the window. Outside, snow fell again, light as sifted flour. Sable stood in the yard beyond the porch, black and gold against the white, his silver-marked back catching the porch light. He was not pacing, not guarding in any dramatic way. He simply stood between the workshop and the road, quiet as a vow given fur and breath. "The past isn't resting," Caleb said. "Mr. Doyle, I understand you have personal feelings connected to this matter." "There it is." "I beg your pardon?" "That soft little room you built around people before you locked the door." Silence. Then Pell's voice cooled. "You should consider your position carefully." "I have." "Then you are declining a very generous offer?" Caleb watched Sable lift his head into the falling snow. "Yes," he said, "this may become uncomfortable." It already was. He ended the call. Elias let out a slow breath. "Well, that was either brave or financially irresponsible." June picked up the soup pot. "Often the same thing." Helena closed her case. "Now they know you cannot be bought quietly." Ruth had already left, but Caleb could still hear her cane on the floor in memory, sharp and certain. He opened the door. Cold air entered the workshop. Sable turned and looked at him from the yard. Snow dusted the dog's ears, his back, the silver mark that Mara had once known by another name. Caleb stepped onto the porch. For years he had believed the safest thing was to make himself smaller. Work small, speak little, ask for nothing. Let people keep the clean words they had used to narrow him. But Mara's workshop had gathered people who refused to let clean words bury dirty deeds. A lawyer with burnt cookies, a diner owner with battlefield coffee, a scientist who trusted evidence more than charm, a woman with a hawk-headed cane, a sheriff who wrote things down correctly, an old archivist whose fear had cracked just enough to ask about a dog, and Sable, who had come back to the place where someone once told him he was not ruined. Caleb stood in the snowfall and felt the strange weight of being accompanied. Not healed, not fixed. Accompanied. That, he thought, might be where healing began, not as a light from heaven, but as one living creature refusing to leave another alone in the dark. Sable walked to him and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's leg. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's head. "No deal," he said. Sable looked toward the road again. The night gathered around the workshop, blue and bright with snow. Inside, Mara's files waited under careful labels. Somewhere in Grand Junction, Martin Keene sat with a memory he could no longer pretend had died. Somewhere behind North Star's clean stationery, men were learning that Caleb Doyle had not inherited a property. He had inherited a witness stand made of pine, frost, and stubborn love, and he had decided to stand on it. Caleb did not sleep much after Richard Pell's call. The workshop had gone quiet around him, but not peaceful quiet. It was the kind of quiet that followed a thrown stone when the pond had not yet decided how far the rings would travel. Outside, snow lay bright under the moon. Inside, Mara's files sat in their labeled boxes, more orderly than the world that had tried to bury them. By morning, the small council had formed again. Elias Boone arrived first, carrying his leather briefcase and a bakery bag that smelled like ginger and poor judgment. Sheriff Nadine Cross came next, boots clean of drama, face set in the practical expression of a woman who preferred facts to arrive properly dressed. Dr. Helena Voss drove up from Denver with a locked case and a thermos of tea she did not offer to anyone, which June Harlow declared suspicious but respected. They did not decide to go public. Not yet. Helena said the evidence was strong, but strong evidence still needed architecture. Elias said powerful companies did not fear accusations. They feared organized records. Nadine said she could protect a scene and document misconduct, but she could not make a federal case out of a mountain of paper unless the mountain learned to stand in the right place. So they planned a preliminary ethics review and recorded statement session in Pinecrest Ridge. Not a trial, not a spectacle. A sober gathering with legal counsel present, an independent expert, protected evidence, witness statements, and enough procedure to keep Halwick from calling it gossip, warmed over in a woodshop. Caleb listened, one hand resting on Sable's head. The German shepherd sat beside him in his dark green therapy vest, the silver streak on his back visible where the fabric did not cover it. He was calm, but Caleb could feel the current in him. Sable had been like that since Martin Keene's phone call, as if somewhere far away, a door had opened in a house the dog remembered. "We still need Keene," Helena said. Elias nodded. "Without his internal records, we have a powerful pattern. With them, we may have knowledge." "Victor's knowledge," Caleb said. "Yes," Helena replied, "and knowledge is the hinge." Nadine looked at Caleb. "You sure you want to be the one to go?" "No." June, who had been pouring coffee into mugs as if fueling a small rebellion, glanced over. "That may be the most honest thing you've said all week." Caleb looked toward the road beyond the frosted window. "I should go anyway." Elias studied him. "Because of Sable?" "Because Martin asked if he was alive." No one argued with that. Some questions were not questions. They were ropes thrown from a dark room. Grand Junction sat hours away, beyond ridges of white and long stretches of winter highway, where the mountains seemed to travel beside the truck like ancient beasts. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, Sable upright in the passenger seat. The dog's nose touched the window now and then, leaving faint crescents of fog. They passed frozen fields, red barns, gas stations with flags snapping in the wind, and small roadside churches whose steeples looked too thin to hold up heaven. Caleb had brought the old walnut-handled carving knife in his coat pocket. Not as protection. It was too small for that, and too dear. He brought it because some journeys required a relic, and Mara had given him that one before he knew the price of surviving. Martin Keene's house stood at the end of a quiet street lined with bare cottonwoods. It was small, square, and faded yellow, with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The walkway had been shoveled in a narrow path, exact and careful, as if the person inside believed order could keep winter from entering. Lace curtains hung in the windows. A single lamp glowed behind them. Caleb parked across the street. For a moment, he did not move. "You smell an old lie?" he asked softly. Sable looked at him. "Right. Too philosophical." They crossed the street. Caleb knocked. It took a long time for Martin to answer. When he did, he kept the chain on the door. He was 72, thin as a folded letter, with white hair combed flat and shoulders slightly hunched beneath a gray cardigan. His face was pale, his eyes watery and sharp, in the way of people who have spent decades reading small print and avoiding large truths. One hand gripped the door. The other hovered at his chest, fingers bent as if still holding an invisible file. "I told you not to call," Martin said. "I came instead." "That is not an improvement." Sable stepped into view. Martin's eyes dropped. The old man changed so visibly that Caleb almost looked away out of courtesy. His mouth trembled once, his shoulders lowered, not in relief, but surrender. "Dear God," Martin whispered, "he is alive." Sable did not move toward the door. He simply stood on the porch, calm and golden-eyed, snow melting along his black saddle. Martin unlatched the chain. Inside, the house smelled of old paper, black tea, dust, and furniture polish. The front room was lined with shelves and file boxes, each labeled in narrow handwriting. Framed photographs hung on the walls. Hallowick's early manufacturing building, a group of researchers in shirt sleeves, a younger Martin standing beside rows of archive cabinets. In those pictures, Hallowick did not look like an empire. It looked like a company that still believed it had to earn the future. On a side table sat a photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a knitted shawl. "My wife," Martin said, seeing Caleb notice. "Eleanor. She passed 6 years ago." He looked down. "Long after I began lying to myself. Long before I stopped." He led them into the dining room. Sable paused halfway. His head turned toward a high shelf near the hallway, where a small wooden box sat between 2 stacks of old journals. The box was walnut, dark with age, its lid carved with a simple pine branch. Sable gave a low sound, not alarm, not grief exactly, but something close to recognition. Martin froze. Caleb looked from the dog to the box. "What is that?" Martin did not answer. Sable stepped closer to the shelf and sat beneath it. The old man's face folded inward. He reached up with shaking hands, took down the box, and placed it on the table. For several seconds, he only rested his palms on the lid. "Mara made this," he said. The lid opened with a soft wooden sigh. Inside lay a faded patch from a military therapy dog recovery program, a metal tag dulled by age, and a small folded note. On the back of the patch, stitched in careful thread, were 3 letters, MVD Mara V. Doyle. Martin touched the edge of the patch like it might accuse him. "She sent it to me after the dog recovered," he said. "Said even a dog knew the difference between care and ownership." Caleb sat across from him. Sable lowered his head onto Caleb's boot, but his eyes remained on Martin. "I need to know what happened," Caleb said. Martin laughed once. It had no humor in it. "No," he said, "you need to know what I let happen." The confession came slowly, not like water breaking through a dam, but like snow sliding from a roof in heavy pieces. Martin had been a data archivist for Hallowick when Mara's work entered the company's development pipeline. He was not a scientist. He was the keeper of versions, signatures, routing logs, file histories. He knew who submitted what, who revised it, who approved language, who asked for older drafts to be made non-current. "I thought that word was harmless," Martin said. "Non-current, such a clean word. You can bury a body under a clean word, and people will walk over it for years." He saw Mara's name move from principal investigator to contributing consultant, then to historical collaborator, then to nothing. He saw safety summaries rewritten. He saw Victor Arlen sign acknowledgments of source formulation data that he later described as independently developed. "Mara knew," Martin said. "She wrote letters. She demanded review. She came to the archive once." His eyes shifted to the wooden box. "She was furious?" "No," Martin swallowed. "That would have been easier. She was disappointed. Fury lets a coward defend himself. Disappointment makes him hear his own name." Caleb said nothing. There were moments when silence held a man steadier than mercy. Martin had copied some files, not all, enough to prove the chain if anyone ever became brave enough to follow it. But Eleanor was ill then. His pension was close. Halwick Health Insurance carried them through years of treatment. Fear wrapped itself in sensible reasons until it looked almost respectable. I told myself I was preserving the truth, Martin said. But preserved truth still rots if no one opens the jar. Finally, he rose and walked to a cabinet in the hall. He unlocked it with a key from around his neck and returned with an old external drive, wrapped in cloth, and a yellow envelope softened by years of handling. These are copies of routing logs, source files, and internal acknowledgments. Victor's signatures, his comments. The revision trail. He pushed them across the table. His hand did not let go at first. Caleb did not reach too quickly. "This won't make you feel clean," Caleb said. Martin looked at him, startled. "I know. It may make things worse before it makes anything right." "I know that too." "Then why now?" Martin's eyes went to Sable. "Because that dog remembered a woman I worked very hard to forget." The drive and envelope passed into Caleb's hands. They were not heavy, not in any physical way. And yet Caleb felt the weight of them through his palms, through his arms, into the center of his chest. Martin bowed his head. "I am sorry," he said. Not to Caleb alone, not even to Sable, to Mara, to Eleanor, to a version of himself who had once known the right thing and chosen the quieter one. Caleb placed Mara's wooden box back between them. "There are worse things than being late," he said. Martin looked up. Caleb thought of his own years spent shrinking from rooms where he might have helped. He thought of all the doors fear had closed while wearing the face of wisdom. "There's never showing up at all," he finished. Martin covered his eyes with one hand. Sable rose and walked around the table. He did not jump, did not perform comfort like a trick. He simply stood beside the old man's chair and pressed his shoulder lightly against Martin's knee. Martin's hand lowered onto the dog's silver-marked back. And for a moment, in a house smelling of tea and paper and regret, the last keeper of the archive wept without making a sound. The preliminary review took place 2 days later at the Pinecrest Ridge Community Center. By then, the thaw had begun. Not spring, not yet. But the sun had grown stronger, and snow along the roof lines dripped in steady intervals, tapping the gutters like patient fingers. The community center was a brick building beside the library, with folding chairs, a coffee urn, and framed photographs of town picnics from years no one wanted to admit were long gone. Helena had insisted on recording equipment, a clear agenda, labeled exhibits, and a written statement that this was not a judicial hearing. Elias had insisted on counsel present and procedural notice. Nadine had insisted on 2 deputies at the door and no one touching evidence without gloves. June had insisted on coffee that did not taste like boiled apology. Victor Arlen arrived at 9:18. Caleb knew him before anyone said his name. He was 62, tall, elegant, silver-haired in a way that looked expensive rather than accidental. His charcoal suit fit perfectly. His camel overcoat hung from his shoulders like a treaty. He smiled warmly at the room, but his eyes did not warm with it. Beside him stood 2 attorneys and Richard Pell from North Star, who gave Caleb a small nod as if they were acquaintances who had disagreed over lawn care. Victor's gaze moved across the evidence table, past Elias, past Helena, past Nadine. Then it found Caleb. "Mr. Doyle," he said, "I wish we were meeting under kinder circumstances." Caleb looked at him and thought of Mara's photograph, the young man laughing beside her, the open face, the beginning before betrayal learned to wear a better suit. "So do I," Caleb said. They began. Helena spoke first, her voice even and precise. She explained the purpose of the review, to assess whether preserved records, witness statements, and physical documentation warranted escalation to formal regulatory bodies and independent research archives. She did not dramatize. She did not accuse beyond the evidence. That made every sentence harder to dismiss. Elias presented the will condition, the chain of custody, the attempted unauthorized access, Nadine's report, and the preservation steps taken after the Green Line incident. Nadine answered questions in a tone so dry it could have sanded wood. Victor listened with patient sorrow. When his turn came, he stood. "I respected Dr. Doyle deeply," he said. Caleb felt Ruth Bellamy shift behind him. Ruth had come with her hawk-headed cane and a face that promised trouble to anyone who used admiration as camouflage. Victor continued. "Mara was brilliant, truly, but brilliance can become rigid. She struggled, later in her career, to adapt to the pace required to bring therapies from theory into human benefit. Halwick did not erase her. We advanced work she was unwilling to release from the cage of her own fear. It was a good speech. That was the danger of it. Victor did not sound cruel. He sounded compassionate. He made delay sound like selfishness, caution like vanity, ethics like the locked door between suffering people and hope. "There are patients," Victor said, voice warming, "who do not have the luxury of waiting for perfect certainty." The room absorbed that. Even Caleb felt the pull of it. He had seen men need help before paperwork caught up. He had cursed delays. He had prayed for one more tool, one more drug, one more impossible bridge between injury and survival. Then Helena stood. "No one here argues for perfect certainty," she said. "We argue against altered data. We argue against erased authorship. We argue against selling hope, built on a foundation while denying the person who laid it." Victor inclined his head. "Dr. Voss, with respect, you are interpreting archival fragments provided by a man with obvious personal investment and documented psychological vulnerability." There it was. Not a shout. Not a blow. A silk-wrapped blade set carefully on the table. Caleb felt his hand close. The room narrowed. Victor kept speaking, gentle now, almost regretful. "Mr. Doyle's service is admirable. His difficulties are understandable, but trauma can create patterns where none exist. We must ask whether grief, inheritance pressure, and unresolved personal struggles have led him to assign sinister meaning to ordinary corporate development records." Caleb's breath shortened. His palm grew rigid against the table. For a second, the community center disappeared at the edges. Fluorescent light sharpened, faces blurred. He was back in another room, hearing other polite people decide what his pain meant, watching his own life translated into risk language. A heat rose in him. Words gathered behind his teeth, hard and reckless. Sable stood. The dog had been lying beside Caleb's chair in his therapy vest, quiet through the proceedings. Now he rose and placed his head beneath Caleb's hand. Not dramatic, not trained theater. A reminder with a heartbeat. Caleb felt the warmth of him. He inhaled once, then again. Pinecrest Ridge, community center, snow melting. Sable here, not there. Here. Caleb did not answer Victor with anger. He stood slowly. His voice, when it came, was quieter than he expected. "Mr. Arlen is right about one thing," Caleb said. "I know what it is to be reduced to a file." No one moved. "I know how clean words can make a person disappear while everyone stays polite. So I'm not asking anyone to trust my feelings." He looked at Helena. "I'm asking them to read the records." Elias began the sequence. Mara's original formulation notes, her dated letters to Hallowick, the cassette transcript Helena had finally digitized, in which Mara stated her objections in her own clear voice. Nadine's report on the attempted contamination, photographs of the annex, Helena's comparison of original safety language and later Halwick summaries. Then Martin Keene stood. He looked smaller in the community center than he had in his own house. His brown suit hung slightly loose. His hands trembled around the yellow envelope, but when he began reading file numbers, his voice steadied. That was the language of his old life, the realm where fear had once hidden and now, at last, had to testify. Martin confirmed the routing logs. He confirmed Victor's signed acknowledgments. He confirmed that Mara's foundational data had been reviewed internally before Halwick filed derivative claims. He confirmed revision requests that softened safety concerns and reduced Mara's role. Victor did not interrupt. That was how Caleb knew the documents were real. Truth did not arrive like thunder. It dripped. A date, a signature, a file path, a revision note, a copied memo. One drop from the melting roof, then another, until even stone had to admit it was being worn away. When Martin finished, he sat down hard. Sable looked back at him from Caleb's side. Martin lowered his eyes. Victor remained standing for several seconds longer than he needed to. His attorneys whispered. Richard Pell stared at the table. Helena closed one folder with gentle precision. Nadine wrote something in her black notebook. At last Victor turned to Caleb. His smile was gone. What remained was not rage. It was fear, not fear of jail, not yet, not fear of bad press, though that would come. It was older and more humiliating than that. Victor Arlen was afraid that Mara Vey Doyle had not stayed buried in the footnotes where he left her, afraid that the woman he had called difficult, rigid, unstable, brilliant but unmanageable, had built a workshop of wood and memory strong enough to outlast his empire of polished glass, afraid that the wounded had kept the receipts. Caleb met his eyes. He felt no triumph, only a tired steadiness and Sable's warm head beneath his hand. Outside, snow slid from the edge of the community center roof and landed softly in the thawing grass. No applause followed. No one dragged Victor away. The world did not become just in a single morning. But the silence changed. For years it had belonged to Halwick. Now, for the first time, it belonged to Mara. Justice did not arrive in Pinecrest Ridge with a trumpet. It came by certified mail, by recorded statements, by careful affidavits, by Helena Voss's blue ink annotations, by Elias Boone's stubborn filings, and by Sheriff Nadine Cross's reports written in language so plain it gave no liar a place to hide. It came slowly. For months the workshop lived between winter and spring. Snow melted from the roof, froze again overnight, then melted once more in silver threads that dripped from the eaves. Caleb learned that truth, like thawing, did not obey the impatience of wounded people. It moved in its own season, under pressure, with quiet persistence. The files went first to an independent research archive in Denver, then to regulatory investigators, then to patent reviewers who seemed to speak a language built entirely from caution and commas. Helena guided the scientific record. Elias guarded the legal one. Nadine made sure the attempted interference at the barn did not get softened into a misunderstanding. Martin Keene gave 2 recorded statements, each one steadier than the last, though his hands trembled whenever he reached for tea. Halwick Pharma did what large companies often did when cornered. It did not collapse. It did not confess in a single clean sentence. It formed committees. It issued statements. It promised cooperation. It described certain historical practices as inconsistent with current values, a phrase June Harlow read aloud in the diner before declaring it tasted like soup made from wallpaper. But the investigation continued. Some of Halwick's derivative patents were placed under review. Internal communications surfaced. Routing logs matched Martin's copies. Mara's name, once scraped away from the foundation of the work, began appearing in places where powerful people had hoped she would remain absent forever. Victor Arlen resigned before the final findings were released. His public statement called it a decision made for the stability of the company and the integrity of ongoing research. June read that line from the newspaper one morning, standing behind the counter with a coffee pot in her hand. "Stability," she said. "Sounds like a broken chair with a lace doily thrown over it." Elias, seated in his usual booth, lifted one of his burnt ginger cookies. "June, that may be defamatory to broken chairs." Caleb sat by the window with Sable under the table, listening to them and feeling no triumph. That surprised him at first. He had thought, somewhere in the older and angrier chambers of himself, that seeing Victor fall would feel like warmth. Instead, it felt like watching a rotten beam finally marked for removal. Necessary, late, not enough to rebuild the house by itself. Mara was still gone. Years had still been stolen. The people who needed safer research had still waited behind doors built from ambition and polished language. And Caleb's own lost years did not return to him simply because someone else's lie had been named. Still, naming mattered. A thing named correctly could no longer walk through the world wearing borrowed innocence. By late summer, Halwick agreed to publicly acknowledge Dr. Mara V. Doyle's foundational contributions to the early neurologic recovery research. They were required to support an independent fund in her name, governed outside company control, dedicated to ethical neurorehabilitation studies and patient safety review. They also contributed to a regional program for adult veterans and trauma survivors needing supervised recovery services. North Star Land and Timber quietly withdrew from the property purchase. Like a fox leaving the hen house wearing feathers and acting offended, Ruth Bellamy said. Ruth had become a regular at the workshop by then. She arrived twice a week with her hawk-headed cane, corrected Caleb's sanding technique, whether it needed correcting or not, and frightened new volunteers into labeling screw boxes properly. Caleb received a separate settlement connected to North Star's unauthorized entry and attempted interference with the protected evidence area. Elias handled the terms with the calm ferocity of an elderly owl defending a nest. More important to Caleb, though harder for him to say aloud, was the letter from the Veterans Recovery Program. His professional record had been reviewed. The prior concerns, they wrote, had been reconsidered in light of updated clinical evaluation, service history, community references, and recent documented conduct under stress. Caleb read that line 3 times. Documented conduct under stress. A phrase that once might have buried him now opened a door. He was restored to eligibility as a medical advisor and support consultant for adult veterans programs. The letter did not fix him. It did not apologize with enough force to satisfy June, who suggested adding a second page titled, "Things We Should Have Known Before Acting Like Fools." But Caleb held the paper for a long time in Mara's workshop, feeling something loosen in his chest. Not pride exactly. Permission. Sable sat beside him while he read it. The German shepherd had grown a little grayer around the muzzle. The silver streak across his back seemed brighter in summer light, no longer a scar hidden under winter fur, but a mark the whole room had learned to recognize. "You think I should frame it?" Caleb asked. Sable blinked. "Too much?" Sable sighed. "Fine, drawer then." But he did not put it away. He walked to Mara's old desk and placed the letter beneath the photograph of her and Victor, not because Victor belonged there, but because beginnings mattered. One picture could hold both the dream and the warning. 2 people could stand under the same words and choose different gods. By autumn, Caleb had stopped pretending he was only maintaining the property. The workshop wanted to become something. He had known it from the first day, perhaps, but knowing and admitting were cousins who did not always speak. The settlement money could have carried him far from Pinecrest Ridge. He could have bought a house somewhere low and quiet. He could have left behind the cold annex, the lawsuits, the memory of Victor's voice, the file where strangers had once weighed his steadiness and found it inconvenient. It would have been easier. But easy had never felt like home. Some places did not belong to a person because a deed said so. Some places belonged because they saw the cracked part of him and did not turn away. The workshop had seen Caleb shaking hands. It had seen Sable lean his body against him. It had seen Mara's name return one document at a time. It had held fear, evidence, soup, old grief, bad cookies, and the quiet beginning of trust. So Caleb stayed. The sign went up in early November, not large, not glossy. A walnut board, hand-sanded, sealed against weather, hung beside the main door. Mara Doyle Recovery Workshop. Woodwork, peer support, therapy dogs, adult veterans. Welcome June said the lettering was too modest. Elias said modesty was admissible, but rarely persuasive. Ruth said the sign was fine and everyone could stop flapping. Nadine inspected the hanging brackets and declared them unlikely to embarrass the county. Helena drove from Denver with a box of guidelines, consent forms, safety protocols, and a look that warned Caleb she would not allow heartfelt chaos to substitute for governance. Every dog must be properly trained and documented, she said. Yes, ma'am. Every participant must sign informed consent for any program activity. Yes, ma'am. No heroic improvisation. Caleb glanced at Sable. She means me. Sable looked away, refusing to testify. They did not open with fanfare. There were no balloons, no ribbon cutting, no speech about new beginnings beneath a rented banner. The first morning, 3 adult veterans came, then 5. Then one left before entering, sat in his truck for 20 minutes, and drove away. Caleb did not chase him. The next week, the man returned and stood on the porch while Sable sat beside him without asking questions. The week after that, he came inside. The workshop found its rhythm slowly. Mornings smelled of coffee, cedar, wool coats, and June soup warming in the kitchen corner. Afternoons filled with the rasp of sandpaper, the low murmur of conversation, and occasionally Ruth's voice saying, "That saw is innocent, Harold. Stop blaming it for your attitude." Ruth taught basic tool use and allowed no one to call a crooked cut a disaster. "Wood forgives more than people," she said, "but you still have to meet it halfway." Elias came twice a week to help veterans with benefits paperwork, appeals, and forms that seemed designed by a committee of sleep-deprived goblins. He kept a jar of burnt ginger cookies on his desk. No one ate them after the first warning spread, but their presence created unity. Nadine stopped by every Friday, claiming she was performing safety checks. She always accepted coffee. She always sat in the chair near the hearth. And Sable always wandered over and placed his head briefly on her knee, which the sheriff received with the solemnity of a public honor. June brought soup, bread, sarcasm, and a fierce refusal to let anyone apologize for needing a second bowl. Helena came monthly from Denver, reviewing protocols, training volunteers, and helping connect the workshop to legitimate therapy networks and research ethics resources. She was still precise, still guarded, but once Caleb caught her standing alone before Mara's chalkboard in the cold annex, one hand resting lightly on the phrase, "Hope must not be allowed to outrun evidence." She did not know he saw her. He did not tell her. Sable became the workshop's hearth with paws. He wore his green therapy vest on program days, though Caleb removed it whenever the dog went outside to roll in snow with the quiet dignity of a king secretly enjoying mud. Sable did not perform miracles. He did not cure anyone. He did not turn sorrow into a clean moral lesson. He did better. He stayed. He lay beside those who could not sleep. He placed one heavy paw over the boot of a man whose breathing had gone shallow. He guided a woman to the porch when the room grew too full of voices. He rested his silver-marked back within reach of those who needed to touch something scarred and warm and still alive. One man, a retired mechanic named Louis, said nothing for his first 3 visits. He sat near the hearth, hands folded, eyes on the floor. On the 4th visit, Sable lay down beside him and rolled just enough that the silver streak along his back faced upward. Louis reached out and touched it with 2 fingers. "Looks like moonlight," he whispered. Caleb across the room stopped sanding. He did not interrupt. Louis kept his hand there, resting on the old scar. "Got burned," he said after a while. "Still shines." No one answered. No one needed to. That was the moment Caleb understood the workshop was no longer only Mara's memorial. It was becoming a language. Not fluent, not perfect, but spoken in wood grain, Dog breath, soup steam, legal forms, and the slow courage of grown people learning they were not ruined. The second full thaw came the following winter. By then, Caleb knew the mountains' moods better. He knew where the snow lasted longest beneath the northern pines. He knew which gutter froze first, which floorboard in the workshop complained when the weather changed, and which window caught sunrise like a blessing. The day the last snow melted from the shaded side of the storage barn, he stood outside with Sable and watched water run in thin streams toward the ditch. The condition in Mara's will had been satisfied, twice thawed, twice witnessed. He could have sealed the annex now. Instead, Caleb opened it, not alone, but first with Sable. They descended the concrete steps slowly. The air below was no longer as sharp as it had been that first day. The old chemical scent had faded after proper inspection and cleanup. Helena's team had removed what needed professional handling. The inactive samples were cataloged, the records copied, the equipment labeled. The place no longer felt like a buried warning. It felt like a room waiting to be honest. Caleb had scrubbed the floor, repaired the lights, sealed the safe cabinets, and installed clear archival shelves. The fireproof files remained, but now each bore a proper label. Copies of Mara's foundational work were stored there, along with the review findings, the history of the investigation, and a plain language explanation of what her research had been and what it had not been. No miracle, no myth sold as medicine, a careful bridge, a stolen name, a restored record. On the far wall, Caleb hung the old photograph of Mara and Victor from the early lab. For a long time, he had wondered whether displaying Victor's face gave the man too much space. Helena had answered that. "Do not edit history because he edited her," she said. So the photograph stayed, Mara laughing, Victor laughing, the young dog in the corner, the chalkboard behind them. Beneath it, Caleb mounted a walnut plaque he had carved himself with Mara's words. "Healing belongs to the wounded first." His lettering was not perfect. One line sat slightly higher than the other. Ruth noticed and told him so. He left it that way. Perfect things, he had learned, often frightened people into silence. Sable sat at his side, muzzle whiter now, eyes still steady. Caleb crouched beside him and touched the silver streak on his back. "She remembered you," he said. Sable looked at the photograph. "And you remembered her." The dog leaned against him. For a moment, the cold annex held them gently. The man once filed as unstable, the dog once marked by harm, the woman whose name had returned, and the room that would not be sealed because it had finally finished hiding. On the first official morning of the new winter session, snow fell again over Pinecrest Ridge. Not hard, not sorrowful. It drifted from a pale sky like ash from some old heavenly fire, bright and harmless by the time it touched the earth. The pines bowed under it, the rooftops wore white. The workshop windows glowed amber against the morning. Caleb stood on the porch in his red and black flannel, sleeves rolled to the elbows, despite the cold army green shirt beneath, dog tags hidden but present. His hands rested on the railing Mara had built years before. Sable sat beside him, therapy vest on, silver back uncovered where the fabric ended, watching the road with the alert patience of a gatekeeper between worlds. One by one, they came. Ruth first, Cain tapping the porch with royal irritation. "Your salt spread is uneven," she told Caleb. "Good morning to you, too." Morning is implied. Elias came next, briefcase in one hand, bakery tin in the other. "No cookies," Caleb said. "Not cookies. Educational deterrence." June arrived behind him, carrying a soup pot wrapped in towels. "If that tin enters my kitchen area, I'm calling Nadine." Nadine pulled up as if summoned by soup and threats, coffee already in hand. "I heard my name used responsibly." Helena came last from Denver, carrying a box of new program files and wearing a knitted hat June had forced upon her the month before. It was slightly crooked. Helena pretended not to know. Others followed, men and women in winter coats, some joking too loudly, some saying nothing, some pausing at the threshold as if the door might ask more than they could give. It did not. The door only opened. Caleb watched them enter, and something within him stood still at last. He had not been saved by inheritance. That would have made a smaller story. He had been entrusted with pain that did not belong only to him, and he had learned not to turn it into stone. He had learned that a man could be wounded and still be useful. That caution was not cowardice. That evidence could be an act of love. That a dog could remember the hand that had once been kind to him and lead another wounded creature back to it. Sable rose and nudged Caleb's hand. Inside, the fire was already burning. The workshop smelled of cedar, coffee, wool, and soup. Voices gathered beneath the rafters. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Beneath the floor of the storage barn, the archive room held Mara's truth in clean light. Above it, people sat at benches and learned how to sand rough edges without pretending the scars had never been there. Caleb stepped inside with Sable. Behind him, the sign outside swung gently in the winter air. Mara Doyle, Recovery Workshop. The mountain stood above Pinecrest Ridge like an old guardian wearing snow for a crown. And on its slope, the workshop was no longer a secret, no longer a question buried beneath winter. It was a lantern, not bright enough to banish every darkness in the world, but bright enough for the lost to see a door, a fire, a bowl of soup, and an old German shepherd waiting with moonlight on his back. In the end, Caleb did not find a miracle hidden beneath the snow. He found something quieter and maybe stronger, a reason to keep showing up. Mara's workshop reminds us that healing does not always come as a sudden answer. Sometimes it comes through steady hands, honest truth, a warm fire, and one faithful soul who refuses to leave our side. Grace often looks small at first, but in God's time, even a wounded place can become a shelter for others. May this story remind you that your scars do not make you useless. They may become the very place where light enters and where someone else finds hope. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like more stories of loyalty, healing, and quiet courage, please subscribe and join us for the next one. May peace find you gently, wherever you are tonight.